If you happen to ever find yourself slated to have society as a whole decide it would be best if they killed you, the silver lining is that in many parts of the world where this is still a thing, the last meal you ever eat is likely to be significantly better than the ones you've been consuming up until that point in prison. So how did this rather odd meal tradition come about, and is it actually true that death row inmates can get anything they want to eat? To begin with, while it's commonly stated that the whole idea of the last meal request came about due to Christ's famed Last Supper, there doesn't seem to be any direct evidence of this. So how did this tradition actually start? While history is absolutely littered with various cultures having feasts associated with death, such as the public feast for Roman gladiators the night before their potential date with death, called the Coena Libera, it wouldn't be until slightly more modern times where we start seeing those being executed widely granted such a courtesy en masse. Once this did start to become a thing in the early going, while wealthy individuals slated for execution, as ever, could generally request what they wanted any time and were even often allowed servants to attend to them as they awaited their execution, common things granted to the poor before their execution seem to have been at best a swig of some kind of alcohol or the like. Things began to pick up steam considerably on this front around the 16th century, however. Or at least things appear to have. It is entirely possible that such courtesies were widely granted before this to even the poor, with documented evidence of it simply not surviving. On that note, things like the printing press's invention in the 15th century began making documented history of rather mundane events like the execution of random Joe citizens more well documented. Thus, it may or may not be coincidence that accounts of such courtesies started to pop up more and more around the 16th century and progressed from there. Whatever the case, by the 18th century, particularly in places like England, such practices were definitely around and relatively common. For example, in London it was common to allow the condemned to enjoy a meal with various guests, generally including the executioner, on the eve of the execution. Further, there is record of Newgate prison death row inmates being allowed to stop at a pub on their march to their death at the Tyburn Fair Gallows. At the pub, they would generally share drinks with their guards and executioner. Over in Germany, perhaps the best documented case of the food practice around this time was that of Susanna Marguerite Brandt of Frankfurt. On January the 14th, 1772, Brandt, a poor servant girl, was executed for allegedly killing her newborn child. 8 months before the murder, she had become pregnant by a journeyman goldsmith who she never saw again after they had sex. She subsequently hid her pregnancy all the way to the 8th month when she gave birth secretly and alone in a laundry room on August the 1st, 1771. Unfortunately, when the baby came out, whether because newborn babies are insanely slippery or she just failed to realize it was about to drop, it fell from her and smacked its head against the stone floor. The child then, according to her, wheezed momentarily and then ceased to breathe. Brandt subsequently panicked, hid the baby in a stable, and fled the scene. However, having no money or means to support herself, the next day she returned to Frankfurt, where she was eventually arrested for murdering the child. Whether she did or not, and even if it would have survived anyway, given it was premature, is a matter of debate even today, but she was nevertheless convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. Shortly before her execution, however, she was the guest of honor at what has been dubbed the Hangman's Meal, a rather large feast prepared for the condemned and the various officials who had condemned her. If you're curious, the meal in this case was supposedly 3 pounds of fried sausages, 10 pounds of beef, 6 pounds of baked carp, 12 pounds of larded roast veal, soup, cabbage, bread, a sweet, and 8.5 measures of a 1748 wine. Of course, the young Susanna reportedly ate none of it, merely drinking a little water as the officials feasted around her. Not long after, her head was lopped off. Moving over to the United States, where the idea of the last meal is perhaps best known today, it would appear this tradition did not initially jump across the pond when Europeans began settling in the Americas. Or at least surviving accounts of executions don't seem to mention such courtesies, with some exceptions usually having to do with drink or something to smoke. For example, in 1835, the New York Sun reported shortly before his execution, murderer Manuel Fernandez requested and was granted a bit of brandy and some cigars, courtesy of the warden at Bellevue Prison. As the 19th century progressed, this sort of thing became more and more reported, as did eventually the practice of granting last meal requests, which by the early 20th century became quite common. So this all leads us to why. Well, as far as more historic cases, such as the early known instances in Europe, it's generally hypothesized that people did it as a way for officials and executioners to more or less say to the prisoners, "We're going to kill you, but it's nothing personal." In essence, offering a bit of their kindness to the condemned before their death, with the prisoners themselves seemingly appreciating the courtesy, at least when it came to the alcohol. On that note, it's widely reported from this that the practice was instituted as a way to ensure the ghosts of the executed would feel friendly toward their condemners and executioners, and thus not come back and haunt them, but we couldn't find any primary documentation backing up that notion. The underlying reason why prison officials started doing this is not any better documented, and there doesn't ever seem to have been any laws requiring it, for instance. It's just something people did on their own, and the idea spread, presumably thanks to the media's then love of reporting everything about the last hours of those being executed, and the general public eating it up across the nation. Whatever the case, law professor Sarah Gerwig-Moore, co-author of Cold Comfort Food, The Significance of Last Meal Rituals in the United States, posits of all this. Last meals may be an offering by the guards and prison administrators as a way of seeking forgiveness for the impending execution, signaling that it's nothing personal. There are standard operating procedures that put up a wall between guards and prisoners, but nevertheless, there is a fondness between them. The last meal, as a tradition, is really a way of showing humanity between the caregivers of people on death row who are completely powerless and who come to care about these people. They feel complicit and conflicted. The last meal is a way to offer, in a very, very small way, a show of kindness and generosity. On this point, she also notes from her research, the most generous meals correlate to the states that execute the most people, except for Texas. Texas, of course, having executed about 1,300 people in the last 2 centuries and trending the opposite of everyone else, actually increasing the number of executions in recent decades. For reference here, they've conducted 562 executions, almost half of their couple-century total, since 1982, apparently doing their best to adhere to the supposed 13th century papal decree at massacre at Messier, "Cadite ios novit enim dominius qui sunt ius." This translates to "kill them, for the Lord knows those that are his own," or to put it in the form that is apparently Texas's state motto, "kill 'em all and let God sort 'em out." Joking aside, Texas's state motto is actually the single word friendship, owing to the fact that the name of the state derives from the Caddo word for friends or allies. On the note of Texas, last meals, and being friendly, in 2011, Senator John Whitmer very publicly pushed for and ultimately got the special meal requests for those about to be executed abolished, at least officially. He noted of this, "It is extremely inappropriate to give a person sentenced to death such a privilege. Enough is enough. If you're fixing to execute someone under the laws of the state because of the hideous crime that someone has committed, I'm not looking to comfort him. He didn't give his victim any comfort or a choice of last meal." That said, proponents on the other side of that argument generally state that part of the point of offering such courtesies is to demonstrate that while the state is killing someone on behalf of and with the express consent of the public as a whole, if it's not done in a humane way, the public and the state are no better than the person being killed. As Professor Kathy Zambrana of the University of Florida sums up, "It comes down to how you treat one human being when you're about to take someone's life." History professor Daniel LaChance of Emory University further chimes in, "These last meals and last words show the state is democratic and respects individuality even as it's holding people accountable. As horrible as the deed they've been convicted of is, the person still has some kind of dignity that we're acknowledging." As to what drew the ire of Senator Whitmer to come against the then almost century-old Texas tradition of the last meal, it was the meal request of death row inmate Lawrence Russell Brewer, who was sentenced to death for taking part in the rather horrific and senseless racially motivated murder of James Byrd Jr. in 1998. So what did Brewer ask for? A couple of chicken fried steaks, a triple-decker bacon cheeseburger, a beef and cheese omelette, fried okra, a full pound of barbecue, a half loaf of bread, 3 fajitas, and a meat lover's pizza. For dessert, he requested a container of Bluebell ice cream and peanut butter fudge. To wash it all down, he asked for 3 root beers. When the time came, however, he ultimately ate nothing. This all brings us to whether inmates can actually request and receive basically anything they want. While the media widely reports this is the case, including with this specific example of Brewer, this isn't correct at all. In fact, in the vast majority of cases where inmates request something elaborate like this, what they actually get is just a simple one-person version of it. As famed death row chef Brian Price, who prepared well over 100 such meals, states, "The local newspaper would always say they got 24 tacos and 12 enchiladas, but they would actually get 4 tacos and 2 enchiladas. They only get items in the commissary kitchen. If they order lobster, they get a piece of frozen pollock. They quit serving steaks in 1994. If they order 100 tacos, they get 2 or 3. That said, other states and prisons sometimes do it differently. For example, in nearby Oklahoma, they allow the meal to be purchased from a local restaurant if desired, though capping it at $15. Other states that allow similar things, such as Florida, are more generous, allowing for a budget of $40. Of course, as you might have guessed from all we've said so far, those actually involved in making or requiring the last meal may or may not pitch in if they so choose to go beyond that. For example, in Cottonport, Louisiana, when one unnamed death row inmate requested lobster, the warden at the Angola prison, Burl Kane, went ahead and paid for a full lobster dinner, with Kane then dining with the inmate. You see, much like many historical instances of this sort of thing, before Kane's recent retirement, he would always extend an invitation to the condemned to have their last meal with him and sometimes other select guests. Of course, as with Susanna Brandt and Lawrence Brewer, it's quite common for death row inmates to forego eating their last meal, as the whole impending death thing generally leaves many without an appetite. The so-called last meal is sometimes not actually the last meal at all, with it generally designated the special meal by prison officials. Even when it is literally the person's last meal, it is usually scheduled far enough ahead that they might still be able to eat it, but not so far away that they'll have to go an extended time without eating before the execution. For example, in Virginia, the rule is that the meal must be served at least 4 hours before the execution. In Indiana, they go even further, with the special meal often coming a few days before the big show, in a time when the person can actually enjoy it at some level. For those who don't have an appetite, they often share. For example, in places like Florida, in certain cases, family or friends may be allowed to enjoy the meal with the condemned. Some inmates instead donate it to others. For example, in 1951, Raymond Fernandez, one of the Lonely Hearts Killers, along with his lady love, Martha Jewel Beck, made a request that his meal be given to another inmate to enjoy. On a similar note, in the early decades of this tradition in Texas, it was relatively common for the condemned to order and be given large portions of food for their special meal, precisely so they could have enough to share with every other inmate on death row in the prison. This extra food request was generally honored by prison officials because it was not seen just as a mercy, but something that helped keep all of those on death row in line directly before executions. That said, not all inmates have trouble eating. Perhaps the most famous case was of murderer Ricky Ray Rector. After committing 2 rather senseless murders, he attempted to kill himself by shooting himself in the head. However, he ended up living through the ordeal, owing to shooting himself in the temple, a common way to kill oneself in the movies, but in reality very survivable if medical aid is nearby, with the person effectively just having given themselves a lobotomy. Despite his rather deficient mental faculties, as a result of the whole bullet through the brain thing, Rector was controversially sentenced to death. The issue became even more of a media sensation. After the fact, it was learned that while he happily ate his last meal, he chose not to eat the pecan pie that he got with it. Why was he doing this? He said he was saving it for later. Once again, showing the humanity of the guards involved, they went ahead and saved the piece of pie, just in case there was a last-minute stay of execution. So this all brings us to what prisoners actually usually request for their last meal. While exact fare is rather diverse, for example, in one case, a person simply requested a jar of pickles, according to the aforementioned Brian Price. If categorizing this into groups, it often comes down to either things you'd find at a McDonald's or KFC, or literally McDonald's or KFC meals in many cases, something fancy, or a favorite home-cooked meal from the person's childhood, or something like that. As for the first 2 categories there, it's noted that the vast majority of death row inmates come from rather impoverished backgrounds, and thus often go with favorite food items they are accustomed to and haven't gotten while in prison. Things like fried chicken, cheeseburgers, french fries, and soda, or the like. That said, some go the other way, picking foods they couldn't really afford when they were in the land of the free, or may never have even tried at all, like lobster or filet mignon. As for favorite home-cooked meals, the aforementioned Brian Price states when he prepared these meals, he always did his best to make it just as the inmate described, or even potentially got a specific recipe from the loved ones of the condemned. Regardless of what camp one goes with, some choose their last meal not on what they necessarily intend to eat, but rather to make a statement. As for such statements, going back in time a bit to 1963, murderer Victor Fuega requested nothing more than a single, solitary, unpitted olive for his last meal. He then requested the seed be buried with him in the hopes that it would grow into an olive tree as a symbol of peace and rebirth. On a similar note, one John Wayne Nobles, who apparently had been on drugs since he was 8 years old, living in foster homes as an adult, murdered 2 women while high on a cocktail of substances. In prison, however, he got off the drugs and became a devout Catholic, and not just a model inmate, but a model person. As one example, at one point he attempted to save the life of a random woman he heard about who was dying from kidney failure. However, while he did successfully find a doctor willing to perform the procedure to take one of his kidneys out and give it to the woman, it ultimately turned out the pair did not have matching blood types and the woman died. Doubling down, Nobles attempted to have all of his organs donated after his execution, but this request was denied as Texas did not allow death row inmates to donate their organs. Going back to his last meal request, he simply asked for the Eucharist, communion. To end on a lighter note, well, relatively speaking, in the 1940s, Wilson de la Roy, who murdered a man while in prison, was slated to be killed via a somewhat newly minted poison gas chamber in San Quentin. When asked what he wanted for his last meal, he merely requested a bunch of indigestion tablets. When asked why, he stated that he felt he was for sure going to have a severe case of gas. The current total population of people incarcerated on our little spaceship that we've named Earth is estimated to be around 11 million out of about 8 billion humans, or approximately 1 in 730 people walking the Earth. However, one out of about 195 nations on our celestial rock, the United States, currently has locked up about 1 in 6 of those worldwide incarcerated individuals, a curious distinction only matched by the likes of China, who has approximately the same number of people behind bars, although about 4 times the number of citizens as the United States to draw on. This puts the United States incarceration rate at about 1 in 153 adults, with another 4 million or so under correctional supervision like parole. In total, this means an astounding 1 in 60 adults in the US right now are either behind bars or are under some form of state supervision. A further mind-boggling statistic is that according to a study by the Bureau of Justice and Statistics, lifetime likelihood of going to state or federal prison, a whopping 1 in 11 American men and 1 in 49 women can expect to find themselves at some point in their life spending time in prison. Further, tragically, approximately 1 in 27 children have at least one parent behind bars in the US right now. On top of this, the cost of incarcerating all those individuals is about $70 billion annually. This means each American adult averages paying just under $300 per year in taxes to house this prison and jail population. Noteworthy, this does not include the massive police and judicial costs that get the prisoners put there in the first place, as well as the ancillary costs of more kids finding themselves under the care of the state, etc., etc. It's generally estimated that the total cost of it all is somewhere in the ballpark of a cool $1 trillion annually to the nation when all factors are considered. So, this brings up a question. Is America just a nation of criminals, or does it have a thoroughly broken system? We'll get into the why of it in a bit, but spoiler alert, it's absolutely the latter, and it's rather boneheaded facepalmy, shoot yourself in the foot ways. But it wasn't always this way. Before the 1980s, the US and the rest of the developed world had a pretty similar percentage of prison and jail populations. But suddenly, starting around the 1970s, the US incarceration rate began to climb rapidly, peaking at about a 500% increase in prison population in a mere 3 decades. And it's only in the last decade and a half has it finally begun to very, very slowly decline for reasons that we'll get into in a minute. But even at the present rate of decline, it will still take about 7 more decades to get back to the incarceration rates seen in most other countries around the world and that were previously seen in the US. While you'll often hear stated that this climb was a result of the United States famously declaring a war on drugs, that isn't actually what caused the massive rise in prison population, nor why it's mostly been maintained to this day. As law professor at Fordham Law School John Pfaff notes, as well as why it's so important to really understand what's actually happening here, quote, "The reason it's important to get it right is that if we're trying to reduce the prison population, we want to make sure we do it correctly. And if you focus on the wrong thing, you won't solve the problem. So if you think it's the war on drugs, you might think, okay, if we decriminalize drugs, that will solve the problem. But just decarcerating drug offenders will not reduce the prison population by as much as people think. If you released every person in prison on a drug charge today, our state prison population would drop from about 1.5 million to 1.2 million. So we'd still be the world's largest incarcerating country. We'd still have an enormous prison population." End quote. A second hypothesis often put forth is the cause was the rise of private, for-profit prison systems that incentivize prisons to keep people there and keep them coming back. While there is truth to elements of this, and we'll get into the interesting details in a bit, private prisons weren't actually the cause either, and were more of a response to the skyrocketing need for more beds to house prisoners in. As with the war on drugs, this was more of a symptom of the problem rather than the actual cause. So what actually happened to cause the massive spike in people behind bars in the land of the free? And how can this absolute dumpster fire of a situation actually be fixed? Well, to begin with, while the full answer to all of this is as fascinating as it is complex, and we'll dive into it in much more interesting detail shortly, if you want the 5-second version, in a nutshell, the cause was simply the political push that has more or less continued unabated through today of being tough on crime, or the alternate catchphrase of law and order. Initially, this was most famously a key facet of the political platform of Alabama Governor George Wallace of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever fame. Speaking of that, this general idea that would morph into tough on crime was in part in response to a rather curious rise in crime rates that happened around this time with, for example, violent crime rates rising about 400% between 1960 and 1990. What caused this rise in crime is still a matter of debate, and some even conjecture it wasn't so much an actual rise in crimes being committed, but advancements in police force methods, technologies, funding, as well as a concerted effort to target certain groups. Of course, nothing is so black and white, and diving into the root cause of this extremely complex issue could be an entire video of its own. But suffice it to say, for now, this all saw a popular political push for the country to crack down on crime, helping to get everyone from prosecutors to presidents elected from then to now, with the general promise being that if society does this, there will be less crime, safer streets, and just overall a huge net benefit to society. But has that actually happened? Well, the short answer is no, not really. And stay tuned to the end today, because the figures when going the other way are astounding in the contrast and how much the US would likely save and reduce crime if they did take a polar opposite approach. Although as ever, the devil is absolutely in the fascinating details. The world's complex, and you should always be skeptical of overly simple narratives, so, well, let's get into the complexity, shall we? Going back to being tough on crime and the war on drugs, President Richard Nixon, the noted bastion of integrity and absolutely never took part in any criminal activity whatsoever, as evidenced by the fact that he never spent time behind bars for those incredibly serious crimes that he totally didn't ever commit. I mean, nothing to see here, he literally said he's not a crook, case closed. And I mean, indeed, it was a case closed because he got a pardon. In any event, Nixon decided as part of his platform to get tough on crime and in particular ramp up the so-called war on drugs, something his predecessor Lyndon B. Johnson had also advocated for. In yet another facet of this complex issue that could be, again, its own video because of all the nuance, it's noted, perhaps not coincidentally, that the war on drugs, especially in the early going, targeted and punished the use of drugs far more heavily when they were commonly used by individuals of the darker skin persuasion, as well as hippies of any color. This was instead of those who lacked any melanin concentrations or peace and love ideals. This all led to allegations that the war on drugs and indeed being tough on crime in the early going had more to do with both targeting hippies and black people than it was about the drugs and the crime itself. But as we said, that's a whole other can of worms deserving its own video and is an aside too far for an already lengthy video. We'll cover it and all the interesting details on all sides another day. Now, coming back to the prison population, this whole tough on crime and war on drugs subplot was later picked up by President Ronald Reagan and pretty much every president since, because as a theme, being tough on crime is a great way to get yourself elected, and being perceived as soft on it is a great way to find your opponents alleging that you support rapists and murderers, because nuance and accurately representing issues and stances in politics go together like fish sticks dipped in toothpaste. In the end, the prison population in the nation doubled during Reagan's time in office, with most pointing to the war on drugs as the cause. But diving into the numbers again, this was not the primary cause of the 500% spike in incarceration rates that exist today in the United States. Even at the drug incarceration rate's peak in 2000, the percentage of people locked up for drugs rose only from 1980's 8% to peak at 24% in 2000, and today it sits at around 18%. While certainly getting back to 1980 drug-related incarceration rates would reduce the current prison and jail population by about 10%, that clearly wouldn't even come close to restoring previous incarceration numbers. So now let's talk about the specifics of how the general tough-on-crime push resulted in incarceration rates that would have made Stalin blush, with the US rates allegedly even higher than his administration's peak, or at least this is a supposed fact you'll see thrown about all over the place when people are mocking the US system. But briefly, on this widely quoted soundbite, as ever nuances everything, Stalin wasn't just blocking up people at incredible rates similar to the United States, but also had a lot of people executed with estimates ranging from at least 1 million definitively to even as high as 20 million, depending on who's counting the figure. But the point being, if you include those people executed by the state instead of held in prison in the incarceration numbers, well, maybe Stalin wouldn't so much blush, but just wonder why the US didn't reduce its prison population in the sensible way and just do mass executions. But look, we digress. Let's start with the most obvious way the tough on crime thing has resulted in a ballooning prison population in the US, and then we'll dive into the more interesting ways shortly that aren't so obvious but have had just as big of an effect, and in some pretty fascinating ways. So to start, we have the extreme ramping up of length of punishment for a given crime versus what would have been normal before in the US and what is typical in many other nations. You see, around the time the spike started happening, and something that has endured to this day, prosecutors started to not just push for longer sentences, but also to push for felony charges for criminal activities which previously would have likely not seen such charges leveled against the person. For example, in 1994, the likelihood of a prosecutor pressing felony charges for a violent property or drug arrest was 35%. In contrast, in 2007, just before the peak incarceration rates, this figure had risen to 57%. Another factor in all of this was the massive ramping up of strict mandatory minimum punishments for given crimes, in many cases taking a lot of discretionary judgment for a specific case away from the judge. For example, in 1986 alone, 29 new mandatory minimums were added to the books by Reagan and Congress in just a single act. To put this in perspective, at this point in the entire history of the United States, there were previously only 55 mandatory minimums in place. Thus, in the old days, specific circumstances may have swayed the judge to go lighter on some individuals or utilize alternative punishments, but now the hands were tied on these crimes, and for more and more crimes as the decades have passed. Partially well-intentioned, this switch with regards to mandatory minimums wasn't just to be tougher on crime, but also pushed because of the very obvious and extreme racial biases that existed and still exist, albeit to a slightly lesser extent, in the court system. Thus, at least part of the point was to try and mandate that any person committing a given crime, regardless of race, would receive in the ballpark of the same punishment, regardless of any biases of anyone involved, or at least that was one of the political justifications. In reality, mostly what this accomplished was a lot more people spending a lot more time in jail than they would have before, while those of certain genetic heritages continue to, on the whole, now see even longer sentences than before the minimums. Going back to the issues on the prosecutor's side, the aforementioned law professor John Pfaff notes, unlike most of the other issues with the US system, there is no easy fix on this one, stating, "What makes it very hard is that the person we really need to target now, whose behavior we need to regulate, is the district attorney. And the district attorney is a very politically independent figure. He's directly elected, and he's directly elected at the county level. So there's no big centralized fix. You can't necessarily go to Washington and say, here's the law that's going to control what the DAs do, because they don't have to listen to the federal government at all. So you have to figure out how to go county by county and either elect DAs who have less punitive attitudes, or you can try to sort of change the incentives DAs face at the state level. But it's very tricky." End quote. It simply helps them to get elected if they appear tough on crime, and Lord help them if they get labelled soft on it. And indeed, in an election year, district attorneys are about 10% more likely to take a case to trial and seek harsher penalties than offer a plea bargain. That number rises to about 15% more likely if they're part of a contested election. Not just prosecutors, but judges see similar skewing, with an average of about 12 to 16 months longer sentences when the judge is in an election year versus not, according to research done by law professor Dr. Mark Howard of Georgetown University. Further illustrating the overall issue, it's noted by the National Research Council that in recent decades, the massive spike in likelihood of a person going to prison for being convicted of any crime accounts for almost half of the entire increase in current incarceration rates. On top of this, they note that the average time served for a given crime has risen over 30%, and the number of life sentences doled out has also hit historic levels, with about 1 in 7 people in prison in the US serving such, though for many with the expectation of parole, with life sentences issued more to encourage good behavior while in prison, rather than any expectation expectation that the person will spend the rest of their life in prison. And on the note of parole, other laws came onto the books during this period, including things like Washington's 1984 Truth in Sentencing law, which requires that people serve at least 85% of their sentence. The 1994 Federal Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, aka the Clinton Crime Bill, further incentivized other states to do something similar, most of which subsequently did. This act was the largest crime bill ever passed in the history of the US and was principally a political move by the Clinton administration to try and change the perception of the Democratic Party as being soft on crime and instead being tough on it. As Clinton would state, "We cannot take our country back until we take our neighborhoods back. 4 years ago, this crime issue was used to divide America. I want to use it to unite America. I want to be tough on crime." But in all of this, in essence, there weren't and indeed aren't more crimes happening. Just the system is throwing the book at the ones that are occurring compared to before in the United States and compared to most other nations of the world. And that's not to mention also seemingly doing, with eyes wide open about it, everything in its power to ensure people become repeat offenders, as we'll get into in just a little bit. But first, let's now talk about the approximately 400,000 people stuck in jail in the United States, about 2/3 of the entire jail population on any given day, who have been convicted of no crime, and the majority of which aren't considered a flight risk nor a danger to anyone. In fact, about 100,000 of them are only even accused of a misdemeanor, yet they can't get out. So what's going on here? If you had tough on crime on your prison bingo card, shocker, you're absolutely correct, but that's not very interesting. So how has the tough on crime thing resulted in historic jail incarceration numbers? Well, a fascinating thing to note on this one is that unlike prison populations, the actual number of convicted people in jail in the United States hasn't really risen much since 1983, almost perfectly rising in lockstep with the rise of the population, an increase of about 40% on both counts. What has seen an almost 400% increase in the jail populace, however, is the number of people held in jail convicted of no crime whatsoever. Up until a few decades ago, when such defendants who weren't considered a danger or a flight risk were arrested, they'd quickly find themselves released on their own recognizance, at a rate of about 40% of people released in this way in 1990, for example. By 2004, however, this had dropped to just 23% of people released in this way. Unfortunately, we couldn't find studies beyond 2004 that give hard data on the nation as a whole, but based on the continued increase in people held without being convicted of anything, which peaked in 2008, we're just going to guess the rates bottomed out in 2008 and have only marginally improved since, other than the brief massive improvement during the COVID pandemic. Now, there is obviously another way to get out of jail before your court date, and that's in the form of bail, which the courts have shifted to utilizing more and more instead of letting certain individuals just give their word on things as before. But the problem with bail is cost and the rising levels of it. Now, if you're wondering about typical amounts for bail, well, this varies considerably based on the alleged crime, flight risk, whether first or multiple offenses, and numerous factors like this. So it's impossible to give an accurate ballpark here because it can range from a few $100s to hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, but the cost of in the thousands of dollars, even for many misdemeanors, is quite normal, and in general, it's not uncommon for it to be several times the monthly and sometimes even annual salary of those charged with some crime. Yes, the individuals do, in theory, get their money back at some point if they show up to their court date and don't commit any crimes in the interim, but many cannot afford the sticker price in the first place. Bail bond services and loans do help here, but many can't get the loans, and as for bail bond services, the person then has to pay a percentage, usually about 10%, which they don't get back. On top of this, there are also potential loopholes that see the state keeping some or all of the money, even if you do show up or don't commit any other crimes in the interim, so you cannot bank on getting your money back and using it to pay off a loan or a friend who posted your bail or things like that, even if you do follow through on everything. Thus, as you might be expecting, given the number of people sitting in jail instead of paying bail for a huge percentage of the population, they simply can't afford it either way, so they stay in jail. Combined with the generally extreme backed-up court system, these individuals sometimes sit in jail for lengthy periods, even months, or in rare cases, years, awaiting their court date to determine whether they actually committed some crime and what their punishment should be if found guilty. Further, prosecutors sometimes utilize this fact to continually try for delays for certain individuals to try and pressure them to admit guilt and take a plea deal. In essence, take a plea deal now or spend, again, potentially months or even years awaiting your court date while you sit in jail. A good attorney can help considerably in all this, but let's just say the people who can't afford the bail aren't usually getting such an attorney, and the likely state-provided defender probably has such an extreme backlog that they also, even if they think you're innocent, may well be pushing you just to take the plea deal and be done with it for practical reasons, both for yourself and for them, and, well, just to get a more certain outcome. That said, the courts do generally try to prioritize hearing the cases where the individual can't afford to post bail, and especially if children are estranged from their parents during the process. But the reality for many is that during this time, loss of employment is common, even just when held for a week, let alone months, as well as a number of sometimes extreme hardships on families who committed no crime themselves, including very commonly children having to be taken into state care in the interim, which has its own massive slew of issues. And once again, these are people who have not been convicted of any crime, but simply aren't being let out without having to pay while they await their court date at rates which used to be more normal. In response to this, a few states have begun to enact bail reform and have seen extremely positive results. For example, in New Jersey, thanks to some tweaks in their bail system, they saw an almost immediate 40% drop in people being held awaiting trial, no subsequent increase in crime, and no real change in rates of rearrest pre-trial, with it going up or down a percent or two over previous levels. The net result of it all was that the state saved $68 million in the first year alone, let alone the huge social benefits of more people keeping their jobs, less kids being put into the state system, and families in general remaining more stable. And on this family stability, another important thing to understand is that many such jails do not offer in-person visitation, even with one's children. And things like phone calls or video chat visitations are insanely expensive, with these costs and restrictions partially also the result of the whole tough on crime push, in conjunction with a significant amount of lobbying by the telecommunications companies that handle such communications for prisons and jails. Jail and prison phone service provider fees got so ridiculous that the FCC relatively recently stepped in. Before this, when making calls, the cost would have been about as high as $1 per minute. Thanks to those recent changes, however, while it does vary a bit, the average is just over $3 for a 15-minute conversation now. Still, not ideal, but markedly better. We'll get into why this whole phone conversation thing, likewise, is a major compounding issue shortly. But moving swiftly on, we have not, as yet, really touched on private prisons and their role, other than briefly stating, much like the war on drugs, they are not the cause so much as a symptom. But as these are commonly cited as the primary cause of the spike in incarceration rates, along with the war on drugs, we'll just briefly now cover the issue before jumping into the other quite massive and probably going to be most controversial issue with regards to why the land of the free has the most incarcerated populace per capita. Versions of private prison systems in some form had previously been a thing in the United States at various points, mostly in the form of the practice of convict leasing to private companies. In this, the name of the game, for example in the late 19th century, was using convicts for hard labor, with some brutal death rates throughout the South in particular, ranging from about 16 to 25% of such convicts dying in this region and era at the time. In these cases, it was mostly black individuals working pretty much sun up to sundown for no pay, but making the plantation owners oodles of money. In fact, the state itself also profited on these conflicts in this way. As to the extreme death rates which eclipsed that of the slaves in the South a few decades before working those same plantations, one contemporary noted of the situation to the National Conference for Charities and Corrections in 1883, quote, "Before the war, we owned the Negroes. If a man had a good Negro, he could afford to take care of him. If he was sick, get a doctor. But these convicts, we don't own them. One dies, get another." As ever, the past was the worst. The more modern incarnation of private prison systems, however, were not motivated so much by making money off convicts, but rather both to try and save money on inmate costs and in response to the rising need for beds to house all the criminals. Thankfully, the present institution's not nearly as bad as the systems of yore, although they're still, well, let's just say controversial to say the least. To briefly illustrate yet another facet of this complex topic that we're now regretting having picked for today's video, that could in turn be its own dedicated video, well, enter the picture journalist Sean Bauer, who notes of CoreCivic, the second largest private corrections company in the United States, quote, "CoreCivic prisons aren't nearly as brutal as labor camps, but they still go to grotesque lengths to make a dollar. I saw this firsthand when in 2014, I went undercover as a prison guard at a CoreCivic prison in Louisiana. There I met a man who lost his legs to gangrene after begging for months for medical care. CoreCivic was often resistant to sending prisoners to the hospital. Their contract required that outside medical visits be funded by the company. Educational programs were axed to save money. To keep costs low, guards were paid $9 an hour, and oftentimes there were no more than 24 on duty, armed with nothing but radios to run a prison of more than 1,500 inmates. Yet while we went through training to become guards, we were taught that if we saw inmates stab each other, we were not to intervene. We're not going to pay you that much, our instructor told us. Our job was to simply shout the words "stop fighting," thus protecting the company's liability and avoiding any potentially costly harm to ourselves. Our job, after all, was to deliver value to our shareholders. If them fools want to cut each other, the instructor said, well, happy cutting. End quote. Unsurprisingly, there has in recent years been a push to abolish private prisons, or at the least regulate them more heavily. Even with this, however, there still have been issues, such as in 2016 when CoreCivic, who had previously been court-ordered to make certain changes to their Idaho State Correctional Institution with regards to severe understaffing, instead just began submitting falsified staffing reports to make it appear that they were in compliance, rather than actually doing it. But going back to why the US has such a large prison population, while private prisons do have a bit of a conflict of interest in terms of being incentivized for people to end up in prison and stay there, they only account for about 8% of the current state and federal prison populations. Thus, they are not really the issue in and of themselves, contrary to popular belief. Their contributing factor to all of this is just more in line with the countless companies who offer food, communication, and entertainment services and beyond to jails and prisons, benefiting billions annually from the current system, and in many cases doing their best to keep it this way, namely in the form of political campaign donations, including that of judges and prosecutors, as well as just general lobbying for all the things most elected officials like to push anyway with regards to being tough on crime, making the criminals pay for what they did and otherwise make conditions as harsh as legally possible inside, as well as to cut recidivism rates wherever possible. After all, recidivism programs cost taxpayer money and even sometimes offer things for free to inmates that non-criminals have to pay for. All things that are true, technically, but as is a theme that we hope you're picking up on at this point, the devil is in the details. So let's dive into those details, shall we? Because this is arguably the most controversial of all ways in which the prison and jail populations have skyrocketed, with the political promise being saving taxpayer money, but the reality very definitely costing the taxpayer massively more while ensuring more crimes will be committed as well. So let's first talk a little about education. Once upon a time, a high school education could commonly get you far in life. That's not so common anymore, and a lack of one sees worse outcomes than decades before for a variety of reasons. Regardless of all the factors that go into it, education level is hugely reflected in incarceration numbers. Case in point, in 1980, about 1 in 10 Black American adult males who didn't finish high school was behind bars at any given time. Today, that number's closer to 1 in 3, and about 2 in 3 of these individuals will be behind bars at some point in their life at least once. As for white American males who don't finish high school, the number's about 1 in 8 at any given moment, and about 1 in 4 in their lifetime. That racial divide there, and causes of it, are, again, a theme in all of this, and deserving of their own video to cover properly. But in the end, for now, averaging it all out, people who don't finish high school are 3 times more likely to go to jail or prison today in the United States than their contemporaries who didn't finish high school half a century ago. And what they find when locked up is also much harsher sentencing than their contemporaries half a century ago, and even more difficulty re-establishing themselves after. And, well, the cycle repeats. So with that groundwork laid about the importance of education, let's now talk about recidivism, which, as noted, is the oft-forgotten massive factor in present incarceration rates. For starters, as alluded to, another facet of the idea of being tough on crime was the cutting of many recidivism reduction programs, like, for example, educational programs. With the rising cost of incarcerating so many people, this was an easy political push. After all, some of these educational programs were not just for things like high school level education, but even entrepreneurial, trade, and college courses for inmates. Further, before the Clinton Crime Act, some of these inmates could even get federal college grants to pay for remote classes. In all, potentially getting their education and other such things non-criminals were having to pay for free. Regardless of your political ideology, most would agree that that doesn't exactly seem fair. It's certainly a dill of a pickle, or at least on the surface it is. Putting the matter of fairness aside, these programs not only save astronomical sums of money for taxpayers, but also definitively reduce crime considerably, and they are a huge boon to society as a whole. As for the savings and reduction in crime, countless studies illustrate this, with not a single one that we could find going the other way. For example, a study done by the United States Department of Justice noted that prisoners given access to educational programs were, for vocational certificates, to find their way back in prison within 3 years versus the general prison population. For those who spent part of their time incarcerated achieving a GED, they were 25% less likely to end up back in the slammer. And those who put in the work to attain an associate's degree while in prison, well, they were about 70% less likely to wind up back behind bars. A meta-analysis by the Rand Corporation of over 57 such studies showed more or less similar results elsewhere. Averaging it all out, the net effect of the educational programs as a whole was a whopping 43% reduction in rate of returning to prison within 3 years. From this, crunching the numbers, the New York study showed that for every $1 spent by the state towards educating prisoners, it saved $5 overall annually thanks to the reduction of the prison population. One study in Washington state further found that for every $1 of taxpayer money spent on helping inmates achieve their associate's degree, $21 of taxpayer money was saved thanks to the extreme reduction in recidivism. This is not even counting other cost savings in court and police expenditures, thanks to less crime, which is good for everybody. There's fewer children and families having to endure everything that comes with having one or more parent behind bars, not to mention a whole host of other benefits. Again, in all of this, the ancillary social and other judicial costs eclipse that of the prisoner housing costs. As a quick example, Operation Pipe Dreams was a 2003 nationwide US investigation which targeted businesses selling drug paraphernalia, mostly things meant for marijuana use. In the end, hundreds of businesses and homes were raided nationwide. 55 people were charged with trafficking of illegal drug paraphernalia and eventually fined and generally given home detentions. The estimated cost of the operation was around $12 million, or about $220,000 per person charged, and about 2,000 officers involved, or about 36 officers per charge. And fun fact here, Tommy Chong of Cheech and Chong and that 70s show fame was one of those arrested in this one, owing to his family company Chong Glassworks / Nice Dream selling bongs and other such glass pieces allegedly as art pieces. In the end, beyond fines and other such punishments, Chong received a 9-month prison sentence. But in any event, given each year about 700,000 inmates are released in the United States, these rather large recidivism reductions from offering these educational programs result in a massive reduction in crime, an increase in a better educated and more skilled populace to boot, and in all this, bringing up the floor in that it specifically targets what are generally the previously least educated group of society. Some prisons and jail officials also note another side benefit of such education programs is that it is something they can take away from an inmate for bad behavior, helping them to better control their charges, help them to spend their time more productively behind bars, and in all make the prison guards and other staff's lives a little easier. Because a byproduct of the tough on crime thing has been in recent decades those running the facilities having a tougher and tougher time managing their charges for a variety of reasons, with things like PTSD symptoms even becoming something of the norm for many prison guards at a rate of about 34 to 53%, depending on what study you want to go with. This range is approximately double that of even people in the military who saw active combat. Going back to the prisoner control aspect, as former warden of Great Meadow Correctional Facility in New York State, Arthur Leonardo explains, "We don't have much to give people in prison. If you don't have anything to take away from someone, you don't have anything to take away to urge them to do the right thing." Beyond education, the other biggest factor in recidivism, as Dominic Toretto so sagely pointed out, is family. On this, it turns out, as alluded to in our mention of the obscene phone call costs the companies that manage prison communication systems charge, another thing that the tough on crime prison system seemingly does everything in its power to cut out is communication to friends or family. This is not just in the form of expensive phone calls, but many, particularly jail facilities, once again, don't even allow in-person visits at all, or if they do, they're extremely restrictive and brief. And this brings us to yet another controversial recidivism program that also just so happens to be just as effective at reducing recidivism rates as someone achieving an associate's degree in prison. And note, on this one, it's not just controversial in the US, but many countries in the world, despite its proven extreme effectiveness. What's the program that most people of the world nope out on for their inmates? Conjugal visits, the value of which, dollar for dollar, cannot be understated in terms of reducing crime and taxpayer money spent on prisoner population. And before we go any further, we should point out that while the general perception is that conjugal visits are one big spicy time session for inmates, the reality is that while of course partners do take the opportunity, as this is often the first time in months or sometimes even years they are able to even hug their partner, let alone other things, it turns out that conjugal visits are vastly more family-centric than Hollywood depicts. Depending on the exact rule for a given prison, it's 6 to 72 hours where you can spend time with your partner, kids, and sometimes other family members or friends in a somewhat normal setting doing normal things. In fact, in New York, it's reported that almost half of all conjugal visits don't involve a spouse or partner. Rather, it's just time spent with one's children or other loved ones. For this reason, these visits are usually officially called things like extended family visits, or in New York, the family reunion program. One Maisha Paul, wife of one-time California inmate Marcelo Paul in prison for robbery, helpfully describes what a real extended family visit is like, stating, "We sat outside and played dominoes on Saturday. After that, we went in and watched TV, watched movies." And while she states her and her husband do have sex during the visit, as is almost universally noted by every other inmate and their partner we looked at, it's more about the closeness and little things like getting to hold your partner's hand or just hold them in general, as well as waking up next to them. She states, "It feels good because I don't get that at home, you know? At home, I'm sleeping by myself, unless my grandbaby or one of my kids want to sleep with me. But they're grown. But they still do sleep with me sometimes. But other than that, you know, I'm waking myself in the morning, or the alarm clock is waking me up, or my grandson comes in and wakes me up. It's good to have my husband waking me up. It's the nicest thing about being married, isn't it? Waking up." She also states of her husband, "He watches me through the night. I know he does, because sometimes I wake up and he's looking at me, and I do the same to him. Sometimes he's sleeping, and he wakes up, and I'm watching him." Similarly summed up by another inmate's wife, Vanessa Coles, she states the value of extended family visits is it keeps our bond going, keeps our marriage strong, and keeps him on track. As for the couple's young kids, quote, "The little one needs it because that's all he knows. The old one needs it to remember what he knows." And as for those arguing against allowing such visits, she responds, "The prisoners are being punished. I get it, but destroying a marriage and family should not be a part of your sentence." For further context here, as previously alluded to, in the US for most prisoners, at best during normal visitation, they might be allowed a brief 2-second hug with their partner and a peck on the cheek, if the latter is allowed at all. On top of that, everything you say or do is being watched and listened to, and the time together is relatively brief. While extended family visits are highly screened and regulated, including regular interruptions for monitoring, it is at least a brief period for prisoners and their families to have somewhat normal interactions. The only time this is otherwise possible for their entire stay in prison or jail, and thus the biggest outlet to maintain those essential bonds. As for frequency, while in movies it's a regular thing and there's a little lead-up time, in reality in the United States, this may be granted at best once per month, all the way up to once a year, or just not at all. And speaking of programs that got the axe during the tough-on-crime push, perhaps none was greater than this one. In the United States, at its peak in the late 20th century, extended family visits were allowed in about 1/3 of states, but began dropping precipitously starting around the 1980s and 1990s to just 4 states: California, Washington, New York, and Connecticut. And further, this is highly restricted even then, with no one in maximum security prisons allowed to have such a family visit, nor anyone who committed a violent crime, has a life sentence, is a sex offender, and other such serious crimes eligible. Further, in Connecticut, if an inmate is a member of a gang or even just suspected of being in a gang, they are also banned from these family visits. On top of that, pretty much everywhere, any inmate who does anything wrong whatsoever while in prison also finds themselves either temporarily or permanently banned from such visits. As you might imagine, having to tell your partner or kids you screwed up and so the visit is cancelled is a pretty powerful motivator. As one Ray Coles, whose temper resulted in an assault that saw him given a 9-year prison sentence, states of the incentive the conjugal visits give him to never step out of line, "Every action or choice I make is made with my wife in mind." As for the impetus for cutting the extended family visit programs, this is generally once again tied to increased public sentiment that prisoners are there to be punished and that the program costs too much. For example, in New Mexico, who recently killed the extended family visit program, it was costing taxpayers a total of $120,000 per year. Now, this might sound like a lot, and if you go read the news reports, this was certainly used as the driving political rhetoric to get the program nixed by the politicians involved. However, it's noteworthy that New Mexico reports an average cost per inmate annually at a whopping $35,540, which is pretty close to the national average of about $31,000, meaning the entire extended family visit program for the entire state was costing about what it costs to house just over 3 of their approximately 16,000 inmates per year. Further, we should also point out that in most programs, the family is required to pay for food purchased from prison facilities and any such costs during the visit. For reference, the aforementioned Vanessa Cole states that she has to pay about $100 per visit for such things, all provided by the prison. Of course, this is still costing taxpayers something, except when you consider, for example, a 1982 study done on New York's prison populace, which found that prisoners who were allowed extended family visits were almost 70% less likely than other prisoners to end up back in prison within 3 years. This makes it potentially not only the cheapest, but the single most effective recidivism program known, even soundly stomping on the second king of recidivism programs, education, as mentioned before, only matched by, once again, those who managed to earn a college degree while in prison. As to why family visits seem so effective at reducing recidivism, as the aforementioned warden Arthur Leonardo notes, those who are able to maintain family bonds while in prison, when they get out, they have someone who loves you and will help you, and in the case of children, people who depend on you. Or as Dom so sagely stated in Fast X, without family, you've got nothing. But to sum up this section, before we move on to the country that used to be like the US but made a change and has seen rather insanely positive and rapid results in the process, the present state of things is that most states have cut back or gotten rid of these types of family visits. Many jails don't offer any in-person visitation at all, not even for one's kids. The cost for phone calls, emails, texts, and video chats are prohibitive for many. Note, for example, costs of a text using a jail-prison app costs in the realm of 50 cents per text, leaving the only relatively free method being letters, which are highly screened with many topics off limit, not just criminal matters, but even things like anything spicy said with your spouse or otherwise affectionate, in that way often prohibited, something that can see a letter unceremoniously tossed in the trash. From all this, as alluded to, whatever prison sentence was doled out often comes with a generally unmentioned punishment of the finishing of a relationship with a partner, friends, and strained best relationship with one's children. Thus, when they get out, not only is the individual now potentially a convicted criminal, and unless one of those people found not guilty after their sometimes extended jail stay, but they also now have an astounding number of often untalked about restrictions that come with that, over 40,000 possible in the United States, some of which make sense, but others, like that some states do not allow you to become a barber if you've committed any felony, whether violent or not, perhaps need some tweaking. But beyond such restrictions, it is now even more difficult to find employment, and even if you do, you're statistically going to make much less than your contemporaries in the same job. On top of that, many landlords will not give you a lease, or it will cost you a lot more, etc. And in all that, an almost inevitable loss of friends and family, which is an essential support system for anyone, let alone someone in these circumstances. Now, we could go on and on recidivism programs, including others that have proven extremely effective, like access to therapists and substance abuse programs. But the overall point is, once again, the mantra of tough on crime and everything that followed has seen such programs either cut back or gotten rid of altogether in some cases, with the predictable result of the United States having in recent decades climbed to among the top of the heap for nations with the highest recidivism rates. On the complete other end of the spectrum, we have the nation of Norway, which used to have a system almost exactly like the US, but around the time the US was making their changes, which gave them what they have today, Norway decided to make their own changes, and the two diverged completely. Today, with, again, the US having some of the highest recidivism and incarceration rates, while Norway now has some of the lowest in the world. While there is no such thing as a perfect system, and Norway's no exception, there are ones that are certainly better than others. And it's difficult to make an argument that Norway's isn't superior in most ways. The numbers are staggering. A few decades after the two countries diverged on policy, Norway has seen their recidivism rates plummet to 20% within 3 years of release, versus the United States is approximately 45% in the same span. But it gets even more stark when you go further out, with Norway seeing a rise of just 5% to 25% after 5 years, while the US balloons from 45% to 78% in 5 years. The result is that today, just 1 in 1,852 people are incarcerated in Norway, versus the United States at almost exactly 10 times that rate. And again, before the two nations went opposite directions on their prison management style and general policies towards criminals, they were roughly equivalent on many points. In lockstep to this change, Norway has since also begun to enjoy one of the lowest crime rates of any nation in the world, with today approximately half the crime rate that they saw in the 1990s. So how did they do it? Well, in essence, just a general policy mindset change, viewing prison as a place to rehabilitate rather than to punish people. As Tom Eberhardt, who worked for the Norwegian Correctional Service for almost 3 decades and saw the shift firsthand, noted, if a horrible criminal act has been done, it's only natural to say, lock 'em up, throw away the key, treat 'em really bad. That's revenge. It feels good for a while, but eventually you start to hurt everybody in the prison and the general society because you are just creating more violence and more revenge. On all of this, while many make the argument that nicer conditions in jail or prison just encourages more crime and people even wanting to be behind bars, Norway has become the poster child for this idea not seeming to be based on reality. Again, seeing crime and recidivism markedly reduce when they made prisons not just a little nicer, but even better than what some who found themselves there were used to. Or as the aforementioned professor of law, Dr. Mark Howard of Georgetown, sums up of Norway's system, quote, the idea is that it's a process of growth and a transformation, so they don't go back to a life of crime. And the results are really strong. They show that people, when they're treated like human beings, will actually act in much more positive ways. Most people don't want to be criminals. They don't want to steal. They don't want to have addictions. As for specifics, beyond things like access to various recidivism programs, as previously discussed, one key tenet which couldn't be more different than the US system is the principle of normalcy. Essentially, while you will have your overall liberty taken away from you while in prison, potentially for many years, otherwise the idea is to take as little of that as humanly possible for a given case. In all of it, trying to make sure life in prison is as close as possible to life outside of it, even wearing normal clothes, cooking your own normal foods, in stark contrast to the fare offered in the US prison and jail, which is not ideal, to put it mildly. Norway cells also resemble more of a college dorm than a prison cell, even potentially having the key to your own cell and without the absolutely massive overcrowding situation in the United States. Eberhard explains why this is so effective. What is done wrong in a lot of prison systems is that they keep people behind bars in high security environments almost to the day they are released. Then those people who are considered too dangerous even to leave a cell become your neighbors or your friends' neighbors. In contrast, in Norway's system, it starts out closer to normal life, and for some criminals, even for the first time or for the first time in a long time, it gives them a taste of what normal life is like for most, and how much nicer it can be than what some of them are used to. Then, over time, the prisoners can earn even more freedoms and amenities as they put in the work and show themselves responsible enough to earn them, to the point that they can even sometimes be allowed to leave and work in the community early when they show they are ready. In contrast, it can go the other way if they don't in some cases. For example, on this one, the maximum punishment for any crime in Norway has been set at a relatively low 21 years. But it is possible, on the other side of that if the person isn't considered rehabilitated and is still a danger to society, then additional years can be added in increments until they're deemed ready. This also ensures, in the rare edge cases of people who simply can't be reformed, there's no extra risk to society. Eberhard goes on, quote, "Everyone in Norway, your taxi cab drivers, your waiters, will tell you. People go to court to be punished. They go to prison to become better neighbors. This is a deeply public health vision. Every policy, every procedure, every interaction in a prison is scrutinized for its capacity to help people and the community heal." Another key tenet is their dynamic security principle. This has not only become a massive boon to the prisoners' rehabilitation, but also to the guards themselves, who, where the system has been experimented with in the United States, has seen a 60% reduction in guards assaulted, marked reduction in guards suffering from PTSD, developing alcohol and drug problems themselves, as well as suicides and a myriad of other factors that are relatively normal for prison and jail guards in the US. As Dr. Bree Williams, founder of Amend, an organization spearheading reforming US prison and jail system, notes in places that they've tried this Norwegian dynamic security system, we have officers who say they can look at themselves in the mirror for the first time in 10 years because they can finally feel good about what they do. They can sit down at the dinner table and proudly tell their kids about somebody's life they helped change. So what's the difference here in guard duty and methods? In a nutshell, the guards aren't just guards, but are heavily trained in law ethics, science of behavior change, social work, human rights, etc., all to teach them to help the inmates turn their lives around. And in all, generally going with what we are going to call the Mr. Rogers approach to prison guard duty rather than the Shawshank Byron Hadley approach. Towards this end, they also actively socialize with the inmates as a matter of course, everything from potentially playing sports to card games and eating meals with them, even in maximum security prisons. And in even those prisons, unlike with their US counterparts, assaults against officers are exceptionally rare. In essence, they are mandated to cultivate positive relationships with inmates and function as role models, coaches, and mentors to the prisoners every bit as much as guards. And for many criminals, having such a mentor who cares about them is sometimes the first, or a rare time, they've had that in their lives. And the numbers show pretty clearly the prisoners respond extremely positively to it on the whole, as do the guards themselves when talking job satisfaction and their daily life at work, compared to guards in more punitive prison systems, again, who 1/3 to 1/2 of the US suffer from PTSD. Eberhard states of this, quote, "A lot of my colleagues, they will say, if you meet an ex-inmate in a pub, there's a much bigger chance he will buy you a beer than knock you down. It's true. Whenever I've met formerly incarcerated people on the outside, they are often thanking me. It's always a very rewarding experience." So to sum up, there are a myriad of factors that have gone into the absolutely massive spike in prison and jail population in the US in the last 4 decades or so. But if we had to point to one thing that would be the root cause, it would be the shift to strongly push for being tough on crime that became a political tagline in the late 1960s and 1970s and hasn't really stopped. The general idea being both that if the punishments are harsh enough, it will deter people from committing a crime in the first place, as well as once they experience the harsh conditions of some punishment, they'll also be less likely to commit a crime again, and in all will have gotten what they deserved either way. Unfortunately, decades of data on both sides of the argument since have shown that this way hasn't really delivered on the promises, and
Quite the opposite, in fact. Much like the war on drugs, the effect has been an absolutely massive spike in taxpayer money spent when factoring in prison and jail costs plus extra police, judicial and social costs estimated to be over $1 trillion per year. We're not really seeing any tangible benefits like much reduction in drug use or of crime, with the net result seeing the US approximately tied with China for the most citizens locked up, despite China having 4 times the number of people in the country to draw from. As the aforementioned Tom Eberhardt succinctly sums up, of the efforts of prison for punishment and revenge as the focus, in Norway we have a saying: if you pee your pants on a cold winter's day, it'll feel warm at first, but then it will freeze like hell. Bonus fact. Coming back to the idea of punishment, perhaps no area is more controversial here than when it comes to violent crime, which compromises 47% of the prison or jail populace. While it's understandable that this group is most feared and hated, fascinatingly, while violent criminals are almost always seen as the most dangerous and the most likely to reoffend by the general public, the data does not back that up at all, not even close. According to the United States Justice Department, the highest rate of reoffending within 3 years after being released are those stealing motor vehicles at 78.8%. Next up are those in prison for selling stolen property at 77.4%. The list goes on, but essentially those who steal are generally about 70% plus likely to reoffend within 3 years and are the highest risk reoffenders. In stark contrast, violent crime convicts are massively less likely to reoffend. For example, those who sexually assault and murderers are only 2.5% and 1.2% likely to reoffend respectively. Of course, getting murdered or the other is definitely going to ruin your day more than getting your car stolen, so it's perhaps unsurprising that these groups are focused on more in terms of perceived risk of letting them out sooner versus the ones who are just stealing cars. It's not the volume, but the magnitude of the risk. It also goes a long way in explaining why family and education programs are the most effective recidivism programs. If people have family support and are better educated to get a good job, they have less or no need to steal, and thus the group most likely to wind up back behind bars won't.
And in the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Gilles T asks, would you be able to explain what happens to people's money and property if they end up going to jail forever? Well, Gilles, before you get started, I hope this is just personal curiosity rather than you trying to get practical information from us, but either way, here we go. Prison by design is a place where a number of your rights are either stripped away or are severely limited in some manner. The right most pertinent to the topic of conversation today is the ability to freely access your bank account and or manage any money or assets that you have. First, though, we should probably mention the distinction between jail and prison, as the terms are often erroneously used interchangeably. In a nutshell, jails generally serve to hold individuals who are awaiting a trial, and in the US they're typically run by county officers, whereas prisons hold those who've been sentenced, and they usually are run by prisons and correction officers in each state. As with all things in life, there are exceptions here. An individual sentenced to shorter sentences, usually less than a year, can be incarcerated in jails. Moving on, in the United States, with the exception of a few specific types of crime that we're going to discuss in more detail in a moment, upon being sentenced, absolutely nothing whatsoever will happen to your money, your property, or your assets. In fact, an often unforeseen downside of being arrested and being sent to prison is that you're still on the hook for all of the financial obligations that you're committed to prior to being arrested and sentenced, and that includes things like rent, bills, and of course any debt. But of course at this point you'll likely have lost any way to make any significant amount of money in order to pay the bills. So if you head to prison with a phone contract or even something like a Netflix subscription, that money will continue to be vacuumed out of your account each and every month. For this reason and others, many lawyers strongly advise getting your financial life, including settling any debts and getting rid of any bills you can, in order before any kind of potential prison sentence, to avoid an unnecessary loss of funds or leaving prison in a worse financial situation than when you entered it, which is extremely common. This can be difficult, however, for those who are suddenly arrested and unable to post bail in order to potentially have an interim period between jail and prison to get everything in order. Then again, depending on the amount of time that you're sentenced to serve, having something like a Netflix account or similar subscription that takes a very small amount of money from your account each month can actually be quite a good idea. The reason being that it is the policy of most banks to freeze accounts if no activity is recorded on it for a set amount of time. This varies from bank to bank, but around 6 to 12 months of inactivity activity seems to be a good ballpark figure for when this generally occurs. Further, if your account has been frozen for more than 15 years, at least in the UK, the government is allowed to take any money in such an account and distribute it to worthy causes, though technically you're still supposed to be able to recover the money even then if you happen to be able to track it down after all that time. On that note, if your account is frozen, a bank should have no problem unfreezing it, provided you can jump through the required hoops. The problem, of course, being that unfreezing an account from within prison is, from a practical standpoint, sometimes an effort in futility, with the best case scenario being that you'll be able to get the account unfrozen after many months of effort and help from someone on the outside. Thus, lawyers generally advise making nominal payments into or from an account while in prison to avoid this from happening. A problem here, of course, is that while in prison, in many regions of the world, you are forbidden or severely restricted to any direct access to any bank accounts that you have. This might all have you wondering, well, how do you make any payments or deposits from prison? Well, in the UK, prisoners are allowed to make limited banking transactions of a personal nature, provided they are to either help you maintain your personal affairs whilst in prison, or to help assist you to resume a regular lifestyle on release. For example, a British prisoner can issue checks, pay debts, and even authorize the sale of property or assets within reason, or even run a legitimate business in a limited capacity. However, there are often severe restrictions to access to telephone and internet banking, if access is given at all, meaning that for most inmates, banking has to be done by mail. It should also be noted here that access to mail and what correspondence are allowed in and out for a given inmate can often be severely restricted as well. In addition, most prisoners on both sides of the pond usually have access to special prison accounts which are usable within prison. This account can be used to buy things from the commissary like toiletries or even personal items like TVs or radios. This is all at the discretion of prison officials. In fact, if you ever do find yourself in prison in the United States and you want to watch a Today I Found Out video, you absolutely can, although it's at an exorbitant price that we have nothing to do with. Honestly, if it was up to us, we'd just give them away for free, and if you're in prison watching this, I'm very sorry that it's so damn expensive. Nonetheless, some inmates do choose to pay that exorbitant fee to watch our videos. To date, the most popular such video seems to be the video on the colourful life of Colonel Sanders, which, by the way, we go into a lot more detail about on our Brain Food Show podcast in the episode titled A Restaurant for a Beetle and $100 in a Bike, the fascinating stories behind 4 famous businesses, so go check that out. And that's not even to mention how prohibitively expensive it is to use a phone to call your kids and other family or correspond with a bank or a debt collector from prison. On top of the cost, there's also the extremely limited time that inmates are allowed to talk on the phone per day to anyone, even if they do have the money. Usually it's about 10 minutes, and that's not even going to get you past that automated phone system, is it? And this is all despite the fact that it has been conclusively proven that increased family communication while in prison markedly reduces the rate of recidivism among inmates. The prison system at work, everybody. As US Senator Brian Schatz recently noted, people in prison should not have to pay exorbitant fees just to talk on the phone with their kids, their clergy, or their counsel. It's bad for human rights, it's bad for our justice system, and it's bad for our taxpayers. Hear, hear, Brian. Moving swiftly on, one key difference between the way the American system works compared to the system in the UK is that bank accounts cannot be used directly by inmates to conduct personal banking transactions in the US. In contrast, in the UK, they can, and an individual can, transfer money from the prison account to a personal account, or even to another person's account entirely to pay debts and the like. Again, this is not an option directly available to prisoners in the US. As Ed Ross, a spokesman for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, has noted, inmates can protect legitimate business interests by executing powers of attorney. We allow that to happen, but we do not facilitate inmates paying their bills. This all has to be scheduled from the outside. Any financial responsibility you have on the outside, unrelated to your court orders, you're on your own. On this note, as one former inmate, Preston Love Jr., stated, "Before I went to jail, I had a car, cell phone, cable, and internet, credit cards, and many other bills and loans that were being paid. I contacted a few of the companies, but many of them said there wasn't anything they could do until I was in jail. Once I was in jail, there was still nothing they could do. I had people try to call and make arrangements for me, but they wouldn't allow them." Because of all of this, it's strongly recommended that before sentencing, you give someone on the outside official, full access to all of your finances and accounts. You could do this with something like a blanket power of attorney, or even something as simple as a joint bank account. Again, this must be done before you're incarcerated because, as lawyer David O'Neill has stated, inmates can't set up bank accounts. We've called numerous banks, but they all tell us the same thing. You have to be physically present to set up bank accounts. Of course, while it's possible to give someone else control of your financial assets, such as a loved one, a lawyer, or a financial expert, there are pros and cons in each option. For example, transferring control of your financial assets to a loved one usually intentionally leaves them the ability to do pretty much whatever they want with your assets. This can be a good or bad thing depending on the person. To quote financial advisor Andrew Bernstein, "I tell people going in to get a reliable person, somebody that you trust your life with, and make them a power of attorney for your bills, for your home. Essentially, you're turning everything over to somebody else. It's got to be someone that's not going to screw you over." Of course, it's possible to limit this person's access to your money, but this may be a problem if they're only able to withdraw money and there's not enough money in the bank account and you can't add more. Given how powerless inmates are to do anything about it, things like identity theft and the trusted person running off with all the money is not terribly uncommon. Thus, for those who can afford it, it's often advisable to entrust a lawyer or a professional financial manager to handle things if you can. And if you're wondering, none of what we've discussed changes if you're sentenced to life in prison, and a person on the receiving end of such a sentence is still required to settle any and all debts. Then again, the data pretty clearly shows that one's credit score and paying one's debts is pretty low on the priority list of people who really think they're never going to be released from prison. However, occasionally people are paroled from even life sentences, so most lawyers strongly advise even those people to do their best to settle their financial obligations so that if they ever do get out, they're not going to get in trouble immediately. And just to quickly say that if someone does die in prison, it's pretty much the same situation as if they died outside of prison. Their remaining assets, if there are any, will be divided up in accordance with their will and debt obligations. The exception to all of this, though, is that if the authorities believe a person has benefited financially in some way from the crimes that they are accused of, in which case many governments, including the US and the UK, have broad authority to seize and distribute assets as they see fit. In the UK, for example, the 2002 Proceeds of Crime Act allows the authorities to distribute seized money and assets to charities. They can also use them to fund community projects in an area affected by crime, or even give the money directly to victims of a crime as a form of compensation. For the most part, though, assets are sold and the money is given to the government coffers for the purpose of fighting crime. This is essentially what happens in the US as well, with assets being sold at police auctions and things like that, with the money going back to the authorities in some cases, or also going to the state or the federal government. If the extent to which a person benefited financially from their crimes cannot be ascertained in both the US and the UK, the authorities will attempt to freeze their bank accounts, essentially preventing them from being used in any manner previously described while everything's being sorted out. The idea here is to prevent the individual from, say, sending the money abroad so the government can no longer easily seize it or something like that. If it's all sorted out and it's found that there's been no wrongdoing, the owner can then access the money again in the same limited way that a prisoner could access their normal accounts. Further, if you find yourself in prison and some debt collectors come a-calling, it's also possible that they'll be able to petition to have the money directly taken from your account without consent. For some inmates who might have no good way to settle a debt otherwise, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. But in a nutshell, if one is sentenced to life in prison or just a month, a person, depending on where they are in the world, usually has extremely limited access to their various assets behind bars, despite still being obligated to pay any bills and debts as if they were still gainfully employed and a free individual. At the time of writing this, conman Stephen J. Russell is sitting in a 6x9-foot maximum security isolation cell where he is sentenced to spend the next century and a half for 22 to 23 hours per day, only let out for things like showers, a little bit of exercise, and to see the occasional visitor during visiting hours. However, even then, he is only allowed to see people through a rather thick pane of glass and not allowed to touch or be touched by anyone other than the guards who strip him any time he leaves or enters his cell. While such extreme isolation, even for relatively brief periods, is almost universally only ever for exceptionally violent or death row inmates, Russell is neither of those. In fact, beyond having never committed a violent crime, at this point he is in his 60s and can't even walk well. Note, the extreme nature of Russell's sentence is officially for fear he will escape the maximum security prison in his wheelchair, we guess. Because of this, he alleges the real reason he is kept in such isolation is mostly due to the embarrassment he caused law enforcement by literally casually strolling out of prison 4 times during the 1990s in order to be with his partner, one who was simply dying of AIDS and the other who he simply missed. Born in 1957, Russell spent much of his childhood believing that he was the son of devoutly religious Virginia natives who ran a large food produce company. However, at the age of 9, Russell discovered that he'd been adopted and his biological mother had given him up because she didn't want to raise a child out of wedlock. Russell would further later learn that his mother had eventually married his father and had a few other children together, but the couple hadn't chosen to even try to take back their firstborn or have any contact with him at all. Learning all of this shook the boy. He states, "I felt rejected. I had a little bit of a problem when I found out." This was apparently putting it mildly. He began to act out in rather extreme ways, everything from getting into regular fights to setting random things on fire and generally engaging in various other acts of minor criminal mischief. Not knowing what to do about this, Russell's adoptive parents attempted to curb this behavior by sending him to a boys' home. During his time at the home, Russell had a number of homosexual experiences with the other boys there, something he would remain confused about for a number of years, noting in later interviews that he didn't admit to himself he was gay until he was in his late 30s. Prior to realizing this, Russell met and fell in love with a female secretary whilst, somewhat ironically, given his later criminal exploits, working as a voluntary deputy police officer. The couple would later marry and have a daughter together named Stephanie. If all this seems relatively typical, well, you're right. Outside of the brief period of acting out when his mind was a bit rocked to learn what his biological parents had done, the man who had come to be known as King Con lived an unassuming early life, including as a young adult being a devoted family man who occasionally played the organ for his local church. However, in 1985, Russell had another mental crisis when his adoptive father passed away. Among other things, this triggered him to reflect on his own life and eventually contemplating his sexuality. After discussing it with his wife, Russell came to the realization that he was in fact gay, and he and his wife agreed to an amicable divorce. In regards to all this, Russell states, "People use the term sham marriage, but I don't think it was a sham because there was a sexual attraction towards women, but there was always a stronger attraction towards men. I finally let go and it became easier to deal with my sexuality because I wasn't trying to hide it." After coming out, Russell initially endeavored to earn an honest living. However, after his manager at a Los Angeles-based food company he was working at as a sales manager found out Russell was gay, he promptly fired him. The 1990s, everybody! Russell states of this, "When I lost my job, that really screwed with my head. I lost control of my life." As to whether he'd react the same way if he could go back, he states, "I would never put myself or anyone else through that. Instead of feeling sorry for myself when I lost my job, I would have got another job. I didn't know how to react because I was angry. I'm not angry anymore." Speaking of that anger, it was at this point that he unilaterally decided to devote all of his time and energy to sticking it to the man. Starting small, Russell first began selling fake Rolex watches and later defrauded an insurance company out of $45,000, about $85,000 today, by pretending to have hurt himself in a fall. Amazingly, neither of these things attracted the attention of the law, and it wasn't until he submitted a false passport application that Russell was arrested for the first time in 1992. He was subsequently given a 10-year sentence in Harris County Jail when all of this was uncovered. This was something that didn't sit well with Russell, whose thoughts turned to James Kemble, a man he was dating at the time and who'd recently tested positive for HIV, at the time a death sentence for most. Needless to say, sitting in a cell while the man he loved was dying did not sit well with Russell, who states, "Keep in mind that Texas was asking me to serve 10 years for insurance fraud, another 6 months for passport fraud, and Virginia wanted 90 days of jail time from me for theft. By the time I was to get out of prison, Jim would be dead." So, how did he escape? After observing the shift patterns of guards, Russell rustled himself up a pair of sweatpants and a tie-dye shirt from a room he stumbled across, designed to hold the personal effects of female inmates. Realizing that this outfit didn't exactly confer the air of authority needed to fool the guards, he decided to accessorize with a radio the guards typically carried. How he acquired this isn't clear. A few days later, Russell patiently waited for the guards to go on their usual smoke break, put on the outfit, casually walked over to the door leading to freedom, and soon found himself on the other side. He states of this, "My first escape worked because I used that portable police radio to tap on the window of the guard's picket. The guards thought I was an undercover police officer. It was such an adrenaline rush. Those first moments of freedom felt amazing. Best of all, I knew I would get to see and take care of Jimmy. He lived another 26 months after my escape." As alluded to there, after escaping, Russell made a beeline for his apartment where Kemple was staying and informed his love that they had to leave. While there were some shenanigans in between, ultimately they made it to Mexico. Russell's freedom wasn't to last, however. This was not because the police tracked him down in Mexico, but rather because Kemple got really sick and needed to return to the US for proper treatment. While in the States again, Russell attempted to commit insurance fraud to drum up money to support Kemple and himself. Unfortunately for him, he was caught and arrested, having at this point been free for around 2 years. A few weeks later, Kemple died while Russell was imprisoned. The following spring of 1995, Russell met and fell in love with an inmate called Philip Morris. He states, "I didn't think it was possible. I mean, we were in prison. He was soft-spoken with a deep southern accent. I saw him in the law library trying to get a book. He's short, only 5'2", and I'm 6'2", and I said, 'Hold on, I'll get that for you.' And that was it." After both men were paroled later that year, Morris set about providing for his new boo. In this case, in addition to cashing in multiple fraudulent life insurance policies he'd taken out on his previous love, Russell applied for a job as the CFO of a massive medical management company called NAMM with a wildly embellished resume, the references on which were all just numbers that led back to him. It's probably important to note here that Russell apparently had an incredible talent at changing his voice and speech patterns to sound very naturally like different people. After being hired, Russell set about embezzling some $800,000, about $1.4 million today, under the nose of other executives. Amusingly, despite Russell having no real experience in such a job, the founder of NAMM would later sheepishly admit that Russell was much easier to work with than other CFOs he'd met and had seemed to do his job rather well. With such a high-paying, comfortable gig, you might be wondering why Russell just didn't simply go straight and resume a rather normal life working for the company. Well, according to Russell, his decision to defraud NAMM was in part his way of getting revenge for how Kemple had been threatened by similar companies when trying to seek treatment for HIV, as well as how the company were treating people. In his own words, "The HMOs put Jim and I through hell during his illness. They wouldn't cover the cost of certain treatments. At NAMM, I watched executives badger their medical directors to put pressure on network physicians to get patients out of the hospital as soon as possible, because otherwise it would affect their bonus. That got my revenge genes all greased up. I decided to make NAMM pay for their deeds as well as the other HMO's deeds towards Jimmy." As you might expect, however, stealing $800,000 in about 5 months was bound to get discovered eventually, and ultimately the cops were sent out to arrest him. Thinking quickly and apparently not wanting to go back to jail, Russell told officers he was diabetic and grabbed all of Morris's insulin shots. Not knowing any better, the arresting officers then allowed Russell to inject himself with 40 doses of insulin, at which point he went into shock. Russell would later claim that this was an attempt to kill himself. His boyfriend, however, would later state that Russell actually did it just to buy himself time to think while recovering in the hospital. However, given Russell's very apparent intelligence and how dangerous such a course of action was, we're going to go ahead and give Russell the benefit of the doubt on this one. Whatever the case, he lived. As you can imagine, the judge was none too impressed with Russell's previous mockery of the judicial system and extreme risk of flight, so set his bail at $900,000, which is about $1.5 million today. This was an amount Russell didn't think was fair. Thus, he decided to reduce it by calling the district clerk from jail and doing a spot-on impersonation of the judge's voice. In the end, all he had to do was tell the clerk to reduce Russell's bail to a much more affordable $45,000. The next day, Russell paid his bail and walked home. A few days later, the authorities noticed their mistake, in part because the funds Russell used to pay bail didn't end up clearing, and they arrested Russell again. This was something that was once again easy because rather than going into hiding, he as ever simply returned to his partner. He states of this, "I did those things because I wanted to be with Philip. I was out of control." This time, he got a prison sentence of 45 years. Not at all happy with this turn of events and missing his man, over time Russell acquired a few dozen green felt-tip permanent markers from the prison commissary and emptied the ink into his sink. But how would this facilitate an escape? Well, after he had his dye solution, he placed his white prison uniform in it, dyeing it green. This just happened to be the same color worn by visiting doctors. Russell offers a pro tip to anyone else interested in doing the same. You have to be very careful because if you wring them out, you get streaks in the material. A few days later, he donned his doctor's outfit and once again simply walked out of prison, in this case maximizing his odds by waiting to approach the door until the person manning it was on the phone, and thus she ended up opening it and letting him through without any awkward questions. The key in all of this was simply acting natural. He states, "If you are scared, you really mustn't show it. You have to act like you're meant to be there. But you do get a huge adrenaline rush. I walked to the woods just outside the penitentiary, and after about 100 yards, I turned around and went like this, flipping the bird. I guess it was kind of arrogant. From here, he naturally needed to get away from the prison as fast as possible, and so he used his outfit to good advantage, convincing a random citizen that he was a doctor who needed a ride into town after having gotten into a little accident with his car. He states, by the time they had their helicopters and search teams out, I was drinking margaritas in a bar in Houston. Once again, Russell could have likely successfully disappeared, except that he made it easy for the authorities by returning to Morris, who the investigators were now paying extremely close attention to in order to find Russell. To make it not so easy for the fuzz initially, the pair absconded to Mississippi, where they were eventually tracked down. Now thoroughly embarrassed by Russell's behavior, which had been gleefully reported upon by the press given the apparent ease in which he was penetrating the prison walls, the authorities threw the book at the con man, who accepted his sentence with an unusual air of sadness about him. When questioned about why he was no longer being his usual jovial self, Russell solemnly informed authorities that he had tested positive for HIV and likely didn't have long to live. For the next 10 months, prison officials watched as Russell became a shadow of his former self, down to skin and bones, as well as showing all the signs of the late stages of dying from this particular virus. Once death seemed close, he was sent to a prison nursing home. While there, the prison officials got a phone call from a physician noting Russell had been selected for an experimental drug trial and needed to come for treatment immediately. And so it was that Russell was granted medical parole and simply walked out of the prison. A couple of weeks later, the prison received word from that same physician that Russell had passed away. Of course, Russell didn't have HIV. Naturally, having watched his former partner dying of AIDS, he knew the symptoms well and otherwise just did everything he could to mimic them over time, perhaps the hardest of which was choosing not to eat very much for many months and otherwise taking laxatives when he did to try and rush everything through his system. Now, you might think that surely the doctors in the prison must at some point have actually tested Russell for HIV. But no such test was ever done, as they already had all the records they needed that showed it, all made by Russell, of course, who simply typed them up on a prison typewriter and made sure these health records got slipped into the appropriate internal prison mailbox. He states of this particular escape, "That was the most difficult. I had to completely discipline myself. You do whatever you have to do. I get my ideas from studying. I watch. I look for weaknesses. You look the whole way around something and you never let yourself get blocked in. I don't think I'm cleverer than the police, but I managed it because they think anyone who is a criminal is stupid and they're complacent. I think anyone can escape from anywhere." Unfortunately for Russell, when he was later attempting to get a $75,000 loan from Nations Bank in Dallas, at the time posing as a rather wealthy individual, the bank became suspicious of him and decided to get the authorities to look into the matter. Not long after, it was discovered that, in fact, the man in question was the dead Mr. Russell. Once this was determined, he was promptly arrested. He did initially try to trick the arresting officers that he wasn't the man they were looking for and was apparently quite convincing. However, they had apparently been forewarned by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to not listen to anything he said, no matter how believable. Said Glenn Castleberry of the TDCJ, "We told them in Florida, if he comes out of the apartment and says he is Bill Clinton, don't believe him, even though you may want to." Keen to punish Russell for the embarrassment he had caused the authorities and manpower needed to continually track him down over the years, the judge ultimately sentenced him to 144 years in prison, 45 years for his various scams, and 99 years for his multiple prison escapes. Despite being on lockdown literally 22 to 23 hours per day for many years now, prison officials are still convinced that Russell is plotting to escape again, with one guard saying of the matter, "If I know Stephen, he's in touch with Philip Morris right now. I'm absolutely positive that his little brain is constantly turning." They also, as ever, note nobody should believe a word he says, being, after all, a master con man with infinite charisma and penchant to get people to believe his lies. As to what he says, Russell states he has no intention of escaping, despite the rather abhorrent situation he currently finds himself in, which he does have a rather lot to say about. Solitary confinement is designed to weaken and destroy a human being. It is a perverse form of retribution. Over the years, I've known 21 men that have died by suicide from hanging, cutting their jugular vein or femoral artery, or overdosing on prescription medications. The sign of impending suicide is usually when a prisoner throws all of their personal property out of their cell. Other than that, they are typically quiet about their intentions until it is too late. I've also witnessed hundreds of self-mutilations. Cutters will shred their arms, legs, face, or neck. Some have cut their own testicles and thrown them out onto the floor outside their cell. A death row inmate once plucked out both of his eyes. I've not been immune to the effects of 22 plus years of solitary. About 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with recurrent major depression. My body is now broken in more ways than I can list, with my spine and hips the chief casualties due to the discomfort of my surroundings. No chair, nothing to support my back except the cell walls, and the restrictions placed on my movement. I'm obese because of the poor quality of the food I'm given and the near impossibility of exercise. Were my survival instincts weaker, I too might have succumbed to self-harm. However, unlike others, I'm blessed with the love of my family and friends. Linda and David, my best friends from Houston, come to visit me nearly every weekend. My friend Helen visits me twice a year from Oslo, Norway. In my opinion, solitary confinement should only be reserved for the most violent of inmates and should never be used for more than 2 years at a time. It destroys the human spirit. Put simply, it makes men mad. It is the only legal form of torture in today's prison system, but it's a slow maltreatment of the body and mind that, in the short run at least, leaves no visible signs. That's why it's permitted. Plus, society tends to view anything that happens to inmates in prison as no more than they deserve. Prisoners, however, aren't necessarily evil or beyond redemption. If we expect prison to rehabilitate offenders, or if we expect inmates to reintegrate into society once they have done their time, the less broken they are when they come out, the easier that job will be. While again, you might think this would have him even more likely to try to escape, he notes that all his previous escapes were motivated to be with his partner by love. Unfortunately for him, Morris is no longer in the picture, never having visited Russell since the life sentence, though Russell doesn't begrudge him this, stating, "I miss him, but I'm also realistic. I don't want to ever do anything that would hurt him again, and any action I took now would cause him problems. I can't be with him. There's no way they would let that happen. It doesn't make any difference how I feel about it, but you can't feel sorry for yourself. I did this to myself." Further, he claims a different type of love motivates him not to escape, the love of his daughter. He explains, "My daughter, Stephanie, travels from the East Coast several times a year so she can spend time with her dad. She deserves all of the credit for my change in behavior. It's because of her that I stopped trying to escape. The power a daughter has over her father is strong. She helped me see that my actions weren't just hurting me, they were hurting her as well. All of my escapes had been acts of unthinking selfishness. In order for me to stop hurting the ones I love, they had to stop." He goes on, "Extreme isolation has given me time to consider who I am and how I got here. It's a daily battle, though, full of regret, flashbacks, self-doubt, paranoia, boredom, self-loathing, questioning, and futility. There are days when I break down and cry. My daily life, if you can call it that, is barely worth living. All by myself, not touching another individual, not being able to hug my daughter. And it's my fault. It is only the future that gives me hope. I'm now almost 61 years old. Do I belong in prison? Yes, I do. I understand and accept why I'm here. I most definitely do not belong in solitary, however. That is a cruel and unusual punishment, completely disproportionate to my crimes. It's also unnecessary. Setting aside my decision to give up trying to escape, escaping is now a physical impossibility for me. My spine is now so impacted that I have to be pushed around in a wheelchair whenever I leave my cell. Escaping also makes no sense now that I have served so much time. Because all of my crimes were non-violent, I may make it out of here legitimately one day on parole. That is an infinitely better option for me than trying to escape again." On this note, even though he has been a model inmate and has for years been saying and doing all the right things to convince a parole board to let him go when the time comes, whether he's being honest or not, it really would seem his fifth escape plan is for once the legitimate way, and maybe soon. His first possibility of parole will occur in December of this year.
The pen, the clink, the slammer, the joint, the cooler, the nick, the big house, the hooskow. It's a new one for me. Whatever you call it, it is the place most of us dread ending up. Prison. A central pillar of our modern justice systems, prisons loom large in the popular imagination, inspiring whole genres of literature, music, and film, and even entire schools of philosophical thought. They are entire insular worlds unto themselves, potent symbols for the nature of freedom, justice, and humanity itself. But more than just institutions or buildings, prisons are also a form of technology whose function is to contain, control, and hopefully reform and rehabilitate large numbers of people as efficiently as possible. As a result, over the past 2 centuries, prison design has seen plenty of innovation, ranging from the practical to the ingenious to the downright bizarre. And few prison designs were stranger than an 1880s contraption that enclosed its prisoners in what could only be described as a giant rotating squirrel cage. While several of these innovative structures were constructed across the Midwestern United States, they proved impractical and unreliable and became a minor yet fascinating footnote in the history of criminal justice. And this, today, is the strange tale of the Rotary Jail. That rhymes. While today prisons have become synonymous with criminal justice and are the primary form of punishment in most developed countries, the modern system of mass incarceration is a surprisingly recent development. For much of history, there were no prisons as we would recognize them today, only jails, temporary lockups used to hold prisoners awaiting trial, sentencing, or their actual punishment, which, depending on the era, could range from public humiliation while locked in a pillory or stocks to corporal punishment like flogging or branding, forced labor in a mine quarry or aboard a slave galley, transportation to a penal colony, or death, typically by hanging. Long-term incarceration was usually reserved for upper-class political prisoners or those who could pay their jailers' fees. Some charged for bedding, food, and other necessities while detained. However, all of this began to change in the early 17th century. In 1601, the Parliament of England passed the Poor Relief Act, which classified the poor into 3 categories and prescribed how each should be treated. The impotent poor, those unable to work due to age or disability, were sent to an almshouse to be cared for, while the able-bodied poor were sent to workhouses or houses of industry, where they were put to work performing menial tasks like sewing clothing, making shoes, breaking stones for road building, or bones for fertilizer, beating hemp into usable fibers, or picking apart cordage to produce oakum for caulking ships. Finally, the idle poor, mainly vagrants, petty thieves, prostitutes, and others deemed unwilling to do proper work, were sent to even harsher workhouses known as houses of correction or bridewells, after the location of the first such facility, Bridewell Palace in London. This system, based on the contemporary belief that poverty was the result of personal moral failings, sought to frighten its inmates and the public at large out of their sinful idle ways and reform them into productive members of society. They thus served as the blueprint for later general prisons. Indeed, by the mid-19th century, many workhouses were built to a plan devised by English architect Sampson Kempthorne, with 3 or 4 wings or blocks radiating from a central hub, each housing a different kind of inmate. The old and infirm, men, women, boys, girls, etc. The central hub allowed the workhouse administrators to more easily supervise and control the inmates, while the blocks, together with the outer walls, formed large open yards where the inmates could exercise. Separation of the different classes of inmates was seen as preferable to the mixed arrangement of older workhouses, whereas one administrator noted, quote, "The young are trained in idleness, ignorance, and vice, the able-bodied maintained in sluggish sensual indolence, the aged and more respectable exposed to all the misery that is incident to dwelling in such a society," end quote. Meanwhile, new ideas regarding criminal justice were beginning to take hold. The 18th and early 19th centuries saw the passing of the so-called Bloody Code, a series of laws in England, Wales, and Ireland that imposed the death penalty for an ever-increasing number of relatively minor offences, such as petty theft. This system, however, proved not just ineffectual, but hugely unpopular with the public, and the government eventually turned to alternative forms of punishment, mainly transportation to Australia and hard labour. But as the prisons housing the forced labourers became overcrowded and squalid, activists like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry began advocating various reforms, including abolition of the death penalty for minor offences, the abolition of jailers' fees, and the construction of separate prisons for men and women. They also pushed for the solitary confinement of prisoners in separate cells rather than large open blocks. This would not only prevent inmates from mixing, discouraging violent behaviour, but also allow for religious instruction and quiet contemplation, which, it was hoped, would force inmates to think on their sins and reform themselves into moral and productive members of society. This system of penitence, modelled on the example of Catholic monasteries, is the origin of the modern term penitentiary. At the same time, however, hard physical labour would deter inmates from reoffending and frighten the public into obeying the law. Howard's crusading eventually resulted in the passing of the Penitentiary Act of 1779, which called for the construction of a network of standardized national prisons across the UK based on the principles of solitary confinement and penitence. But due to budgetary constraints and political squabbling, no such facilities were ever built as a direct result of the act. However, across the Atlantic, Howard's ideas were being pushed to their logical extreme. In 1786, the state of Pennsylvania passed a law mandating that all convicts not sentenced to death be used as forced labor for public works like building roads. It was envisioned that this scheme would not only allow the state to extract useful free labor from the prison population, but also provide the public with a dramatic demonstration of what awaited those who broke the law. Unfortunately, the law had the opposite effect, drawing public outrage over the harsh treatment of prisoners. In response, reformers like Father Benjamin Rush suggested something resembling the English workhouse system, where convicts could still be made to perform useful labor, only out of the public eye, in a strictly regulated environment where, quote, bodily pain, labor, watchfulness, solitude, and silence joined with cleanliness and a simple diet. These ideas led to the development of the so-called separate system, or Pennsylvania system, first implemented in 1829 at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. In this system, every effort was made to erase the inmates' individuality and isolate them from each other and their guards. The inmates were given numbers instead of names, confined in solitary cells, forbidden to speak to anyone, and when taken out of their cells were forced to wear masks or hoods or tethered together with ropes or chains too long to allow conversation. Even religious services and exercise in the prison yards was conducted while confined in small cubicle-like booths. The prison's architecture itself was designed to maximize isolation, with long cell blocks radiating out from a central administrative hub, as in Sampson Kempthorpe's workhouse designs. As per John Howard's original theories, the regime of total isolation was meant to insulate inmates from potential bad influences and force them to contemplate their actions and spiritually rehabilitate themselves. The separate system proved highly influential, with the Eastern State Penitentiary model soon being adopted across the United States, including at New York's Newgate, Sing Sing, and Auburn prisons, the latter introducing further innovations such as chaining its prisoners together and making them walk everywhere in lockstep and forcing them to wear the now iconic black and white striped prison uniforms. The system soon made its way to Britain, where in 1839 Parliament passed the Prison Act, mandating the organisation of penitentiaries according to the separate system. By this time, however, the use of convicts to perform useful labour had fallen out of fashion due to the unfair economic competition such free labour posed to various industries. Instead, inmates were punished and kept occupied by making them perform hard, repetitive, but useless tasks such as silently passing a heavy cannonball back and forth, walking on a treadmill, or turning a crank machine that drove a series of paddles or scoops through a box of sand or gravel. So, if walking on the treadmill at the gym feels suspiciously like punishment, it's because that's what it was originally invented for. Eventually, more than 300 prisons around the world would adopt the Pennsylvania system, though by the end of the 19th century, it became clear that the system did little to actually reform convicts or reduce crime, and more humane incarceration regimes were subsequently adopted, which allowed prisoners to mingle, socialize, and engage in leisure activities. But whatever the system employed, as long-term incarceration became the preferred method of criminal punishment and prisons became increasingly crowded, administrators faced the problem of how to monitor and control large numbers of inmates with a comparatively small number of guards. This led to the development of further architectural and technical innovations. For example, many separate system prisons featured special drum cells with vaulted ceilings that acted like whispering galleries, allowing a guard at the end of the cell block to hear even the lowest whisper and enforce the regime of absolute silence. A later 20th century innovation, more famously used at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, was a mechanism that allowed cells to be unlocked and opened by guards using levers at the end of the cell block, eliminating individual locking mechanisms which prisoners could potentially tamper with. But perhaps the most original and infamous solution to the problem of controlling prisoners was the panopticon, devised in 1786 by English philosopher and founder of utilitarianism Jeremy Bentham. In Bentham's scheme, individual cells were arranged along the walls of a cylindrical building, their doors facing inward. At the center of the cylindrical atrium or rotunda stood a tall guard tower resembling a lighthouse, built so that the guards could see inside all the cells, but the prisoners inside the cells could not clearly see the guards. According to Bentham, as a prisoner could not be sure if they were being observed at any given time, they would constantly remain on their best behavior. In this manner, the architecture of the panopticon allowed a large amount of control to be exerted over a large population of inmates by a very small number of guards. No panopticon prisons were actually built during Bentham's lifetime, and very few afterwards, with perhaps the most famous being the Presidio Modelo in Cuba, completed in 1931, and which briefly housed Cuban revolutionaries Fidel and Raul Castro. In the late 19th century, a few examples were also built in the Netherlands by architect Johan Mazzala, who introduced the further innovation of having a priest deliver sermons directly from the guard tower, eliminating the need to move the inmates into a separate chapel. During the Second World War, however, the occupying Nazis commandeered many of these prisons to house political prisoners, and many politicians who had championed the panopticon were made to experience firsthand its dehumanizing effects. So, whoopsie-daisy there. Unsurprisingly, after the war, the Dutch adopted a decidedly more humane regime. But while few actual panopticon prisons were ever built, the basic concept has had an outsized impact on modern culture, being used by many philosophers and social critics, most famously French postmodernist philosopher Foucault, as a metaphor for more abstract systems of of societal surveillance and control. And with the advent of closed-circuit television and similar systems in the mid-20th century, Bentham's vision of total surveillance and control became a physical reality. Meanwhile, the problem of controlling large numbers of prisoners with minimal staff was being felt more acutely by small county jails, especially in American frontier cities and towns, which were often strapped for manpower and other resources. And it is this problem which led to the invention of perhaps the most ingenious and bizarre correctional facility designed in history, the rotary jail. The rotary jail was patented in July 1881 by architect William Brown and foundry owner Benjamin Hoare of Indianapolis, Indiana. According to Brown's original patent quote, "The object of our invention is to produce a jail in which prisoners can be controlled without the necessity of personal contact between them and the jailer or guard." End quote. The jail consisted of a 16-ton cylindrical steel cage divided into several pie-slice-shaped cells contained within a cylindrical stone or brick building. While every cell had its own door, the building had only one opening, meaning that normally all the cells faced a solid wall, making escape nearly impossible. However, the entire cage structure was mounted on conical rollers and fitted with a geared crank mechanism similar to those used in railroad turntables, so that any given cell could be rotated to line up with the single opening. This system allowed a small number of guards to easily confine and control a large number of inmates. But the innovations didn't end there. The rotary jail also included an integrated coal-burning furnace to keep the prisoners warm during the winter months, as well as plumbed-in toilets, a considerable luxury at the time, but a necessary one given the difficulty of extracting a prisoner to allow them to use the facilities. Water, waste, and hot air all traveled through an 8-foot hollow cast-iron shaft at the center of the cage, an arrangement which conveniently prevented the pipes from freezing in the winter. The side walls of each cell were closed off with a plate of sheet iron, completely segregating the prisoners from each other. According to contemporary catalogues, this meant that, quote, "someone detained as a witness would not be obligated to associate with the vulgar and unfeeling criminal." The segregated design also allowed the jailer to offer better food and other amenities to more well-behaved prisoners without the others being aware of their disparate treatment. Another unusual advantage of the system, detailed in an 1887 article in the Salt Lake Tribune, was that, quote, "during the night, when there is danger of an attempt to escape, the cells can be kept slowly revolving by a small water-powered motor or any motive power most convenient." End quote. At least 2 rotary jails are known to have been equipped with such a system, Council Bluffs, Iowa, and Salt Lake City, Utah, but apparently they were seldom used, as a 1927 article in the Deseret News explained, quote, "prisoners were not submitted to the torture of being turned around and around till driven half mad, as in an eastern center, though the construction was of the same type." End quote. The very first rotary jail was installed in Crawfordsville, Indiana in 1882 by inventor Benjamin Hoare's Hoare-Ketchman Company Irons Foundry. Shortly afterward, however, Hoare and co-inventor William Brown sold the rights to their creation to an agent named Charles H. Sparks. Less interested in building jails than attracting business to Hoare's foundry, the pair allowed Sparks to contract any company he pleased to build the surrounding stone and brick structures, so long as the ironwork for the rotary jails themselves came from Hoare-Ketchman Company. The next 3 rotary jails were built in Maysville and Maryville, Missouri, and Council Bluffs, Iowa, construction being contracted to a St. Louis firm called Aldrich & Mann. After this, Charles Sparks signed a contract with the Patent Rotary Jail Company of Chicago to build complete rotary jails per Brown and Hoare's designs. However, their patent proved relatively easy to get around, and in September 1888, Peter J. Pauley and James J. Legan of the Pauley Jail Building and Manufacturing Company of St. Louis secured a patent for an improved rotary jail. The Pauley Company would go on to manufacture the vast majority of rotary jails installed across the US over the following decade. Interestingly, the company's sales agent was none other than Charles Sparks, who also represented the rival Patent Rotary Jail Company, despite the latter's claims of exclusivity. The exact number of rotary jails constructed is not known for certain, though the number most agreed upon is 18. At least 2, the Pottawatomie County Jail in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the Douglas Jail in Omaha, Nebraska, had 3 stacked levels for a total of 30 cells. 3 had 1 story, and the rest had 2 stories. Some locations also included regular, non-rotating cells and an upper level to quarantine sick prisoners and prisoners in solitary confinement or dungeon cells in the basement. As expected, small rural justice departments were attracted to the labor-saving advantages of the rotary jail, as well as its air of modernity. Indeed, in February 1887, Francis Armstrong, mayor of Salt Lake City, and probate judge Elias A. Smith traveled east from Utah to study the latest developments in jail technology. The original Salt Lake County Jail, built in 1855, was frequently understaffed and prone to prisoner escapes, and the county court decided to seek out a more cutting-edge solution. Throughout their week-long expedition, the pair visited jails of various designs in Midwest western cities like Council Bluffs, St. Louis, and Omaha. Upon their return, Mayor Armstrong stated that he preferred traditional square jail cells, while Judge Smith declared that, quote, "In my own mind, I have no doubt that the Rotary Jail was the one thing needful here." In the end, Judge Smith's preference prevailed, and in the early summer of 1887, construction of a 3-story Rotary Jail with 30 cells was begun at 268 West 2nd South Street in Salt Lake City. By July of the following year, the structure was complete and ready for occupancy. The new jail caused much excitement, with a grand jury invited to tour the facility, reporting that, quote, "We beg to report that we found the county jail in excellent condition. Clean, well ventilated, heated and lighted. The culinary department well conducted, the attendants courteous and kind." True to William Brown and Benjamin Hall's original design intent, the cutting-edge jail proved nearly escape-proof. Indeed, nearly all who managed to break out did so while outside of the squirrel cage itself. For example, in September 1888, just 2 months after the Salt Lake County Jail opened, a guard took a prisoner out of the rotary cage so that he could work on the jail lawn. The guard then became distracted, allowing the unattended prisoner to flee. In December 1892, the Salt Lake Tribune reported another attempt, quote, "An ineffectual attempt to break jail was made at the county jail Sunday afternoon. The prisoners timed their action well. It seems that jailer Joe Burt goes home at about 5:30, and the night jailer is not called up for an hour later. Joe Burt did not go home at the usual time that day, and a few minutes later, he was surprised to hear the rotary in the jail revolve. The prisoners had sprung the brake so that it would not hold and started the rotary going around. If they had had a key, escape would have rewarded their efforts, but Burt summoned assistance and quelled the disturbance. Several cells were searched, and a miscellaneous collection of tools were found." End quote. In 1898, a prisoner plotted to escape, creating a fake handgun out of wood, soap, and tinfoil. However, his plan was foiled when a fellow inmate ratted him out. Indeed, among the only inmates known to have broken out of the squirrel cage itself was Charles Reese, who, on February 1st, 1907, sawed through his cell bars and climbed out a window using the classic technique of tying bedsheets together. As to how Reese managed to smuggle in the saw and cut his way out so noiselessly, the Ogden Standard Examiner speculated that, quote, "Small steel saws made of the best material are encased in silk and forced into any recess in the body. They are placed in the mouth or, after being soaped, are concealed internally. These saws, although not much thicker or wider than a watch spring, will cut through the hardest material used in cell construction, and they operate noiselessly when soaped. When a prisoner thus equipped successfully passes the scrutiny of the wardens of a jail, he has an open sesame to liberty." End quote. Yet despite early enthusiasm and praise, the rotary jail quickly proved itself a seriously flawed concept. For one thing, the rotation mechanism was constantly breaking down, leaving prisoners trapped for hours or even days on end. The Pauley Jail Building and Manufacturing Company ascribed these issues to shoddy craftsmanship on the part of the building contractors, stating in its catalogs that, quote, "We devote much time and thought to the study of hygiene and sanitary appliances, though have found much trouble in getting county officials to realize the importance of these factors in the construction of scientific jails. Many counties seem unwilling to expend sufficient money to build such a jail as is actually needed, and our efforts have frequently been retarded by men of other trades who, by their gross ignorance of what is required to construct a good jail, offer some claptrap fare to the county officials at a low figure, when in fact the county ought to be paid to have such an imposition placed in their county." End quote. Yet, even when the rotation mechanism did work as intended, it was painfully slow and laborious to operate. This was especially problematic in the case of a fire, as the prisoners could only be evacuated one at a time. In several locations, including Salt Lake City and Oswego, New York, this problem was alleviated somewhat by the installation of a water falling weight or electric motor, but this often caused its own problem, as an Oswego newspaper reported, quote, "When the sheriff wished to gain access to a particular cell, he touched a button and the table would turn in response until the cell he wished to enter swung opposite the door of the sheriff's office. But there were times when the mechanism would strike and fail to function. These times were hard on both sheriff and prisoners alike, as it meant hungry, annoyed, and frightened prisoners until the cause of the trouble could be located and repairs made, for there was no way of getting food into the cells or men in or out when the turntable was on strike for several days at a time. But whatever the means of motive power employed, the jails proved inherently dangerous, with several prisoners being severely injured when various body parts became stuck in the rotating cage. One inmate in Crawfordsville got an arm caught in the bars and had to be cut free with torches, while in 1904 a prisoner in Maryville, Missouri was killed when his head was crushed. There were other problems as well. While initial construction costs around $30,000 were comparable to regular jail jails, the need for constant maintenance and replacement of gears, bearings, and other precision mechanical components pushed operating costs beyond what many rural justice departments could easily afford. Even worse, the Rotary jail's innovative and much touted sanitary system proved prone to clogging and backing up. Indeed, one member of the industrial workers of the world, imprisoned at Council Bluffs during the First World War, later described the deplorable conditions inside the squirrel cage thusly: refuse is left in the toilet until the guard can't stand the stench any longer, then water is turned in and both the top and bottom troughs are washed out. Cannot give you any idea of the filthy thing the Rotary is, and besides, no one would believe it. But of the 23 jails I've been in, I've never seen anything like a Rotary. Not a cell is light enough to read in. Not room to walk. Only 2 steps. End quote. Indeed, overcrowding was also a common issue, with the Crawfordsville jail, originally designed to hold 30 people, reportedly housing as many as 165 in 1929. Even the Rotary jail's greatest selling feature, labor savings, became one of its greatest drawbacks, as many facilities fell prey to neglect and decay. Indeed, the central utilities shaft of the Crawfordsville jail eventually became so corroded that one inmate was able to rip his toilet right off of its mountings, climb down the shaft into the basement, and escape out of the building's coal chute. Thanks to these and other problems, in the eyes of the public, Rotary jails quickly went from humane and cutting-edge pieces of corrections technology to barbaric relics of a bygone age, with one commentator in Wichita, Kansas, stating in 1918 that, quote, "There remains to be described a device for confirming men that exhibits both ingenuity and perverted purpose. It combines the efficiency of modern invention with the insensibility of the 13th century. Yet it is defended by people who are no doubt quite humane in their private lives," end quote. As a result, by the early 20th century, many Rotary jails had their rotary mechanisms disabled and doors cut in the outer stone or brick wall, converting them into regular, albeit uniquely cylindrical jails. Others were entirely condemned and torn down, starting with Appleton, Wisconsin in 1905 and Oswego, New York in 1909. By 1939, nearly all had been demolished. However, a few soldiered on through the 20th century as curious anachronisms. For example, the Pottawatomie County Jail in Council Bluffs, Iowa, remained in use until December 1969. However, its rotary mechanism was disabled in 1960 following an incident where a prisoner died in his cell and, due to a mechanical breakdown, could not be extracted for several days. The Rotary Jail in Crawfordsville, Indiana, the first ever built, only closed down in 1973, its rotary mechanism having been disabled in 1938, while the last to be shut down was the one-story Rotary Jail in Gallatin, Missouri, which closed its doors in 1975. Today, all 3 are preserved as museums, the only Rotary jail still in existence, though only the Crawfordsville jail still features a working rotation mechanism. Though all but forgotten today, Rotary jails offer a fascinating glimpse into an era of rapid innovation and rapidly changing ideas about criminal justice, a time when technology and rationality were seen as cures for all of society's ills. They are also a perfect and rather amusing example of over-engineering at its finest. As Kurt Kohlstedt of the podcast 99% Visible points out, perhaps the biggest mystery behind the Rotary jail is also the most fundamental. Why should it rotate to begin with? Even granting the potential advantages of allowing access to only one cell at a time, there are other ways to make that work. The bars, for instance, could spin on a track around the cells rather than the cells themselves needing to move, or a system of interlocking mechanisms could be employed to allow just one cell to open at a time. Indeed, many such mechanisms were introduced in the early 20th century, quickly rendering the overly complex and temperamental Rotary jails obsolete. But the history of every technology is rife with false starts, bizarre experiments, and dead ends, and prison design is no exception. And while these strange squirrel cages now lie silent and still, the wheels of justice continue to turn.
While Danny Trejo might not be a name many people would recognize as much as, say, Tom Cruise, with over 300 film credits to date since his acting debut in the mid-1980s, not to mention his distinctive, hard-as-nails look, he's certainly one of the more recognizable faces in Hollywood. Unlike most, however, Danny's trail to becoming one of the hardest-working actors in Hollywood began in prison while facing 3 gas chamber-worthy offenses. Throughout his earlier years, Trejo, a California native, spent time in most every major youth detention center and prison in the state, including Folsom, Soledad, and San Quentin, where Trejo became a celebrity of sorts thanks to his impressive boxing skills. According to Trejo, he was the light and welterweight boxing champion of just about every prison he spent time in. Of course, he also noted after visiting his former cell in San Quentin during the filming of Champion, it wasn't frightening. It was like you're reliving a bad dream, and you're no longer able to hide the fact that you were scared to death. Okay, you tell yourself, I'm the baddest motherfucker here. You know, I climbed back to the top. Well, you go back, and you're no longer able to lie to yourself. I was on top, but I was on top of a pile of shit. The turning point in Trejo's life came in 1968, when on Cinco de Mayo of that year, Trejo and several of his cohorts decided to start a prison riot, as you do. During the ensuing chaos, among other crimes, Trejo seriously injured a guard when he hit him in the head with a rock. This was a crime he doesn't dispute today, though he does claim he was actually aiming for someone else and the guard just got in the way. After the incident, Trejo was put into solitary confinement, where he was convinced he was going to receive the death penalty given some of the charges that were being leveled against him. With an extremely lengthy rap sheet already at that point, despite his young age, 24 years old, committing his first armed robbery at 14, he fully expected they'd throw the book at him. Trejo recalls that at this moment he prayed to God saying, "God, if you're there, everything will turn out the way it's supposed to. If you're not, I'm fucked." In the end, Trejo got off scot-free. You see, there were no witnesses willing to testify against him on any of the charges he was facing. 3,000 inmates, and they had no witnesses, he later stated. This was the catalyst for Trejo to decide to turn his life around, beginning by swearing off drink and drugs. It was almost mathematical. I thought every time I've been arrested, there was alcohol and drugs involved. Every time. At this point, Trejo had been drinking alcohol and doing various drugs since he was 8 years old, including doing heroin for the first time at 12. When Trejo was paroled a year later in 1969, he enrolled himself in a number of programs intended to help him stay clean, including Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous. Trejo also became a drug counselor, working with teenagers with substance abuse problems. I knew that the only way I could stay out of prison was to dedicate my life to helping other people. People who are clean and sober do good things for people and seem to have good lives. When you talk about my big break, I got a few of them in my life, but everything good that ever happened to me has happened as a direct result of helping someone else. Speaking of breaks as a result of helping other people, Trejo's big career break came in the form of a phone call from one of the kids he was counseling in 1985. The 18-year-old young man said he was tempted by the large amounts of cocaine at work and needed some help resisting. Without hesitation, Trejo noted down the address the young man gave him and drove to meet him. Trejo explained, "So I went down, and as it turned out, the kid was working as a PA on a movie set. It was the film Runaway Train with Jon Voight and Eric Roberts. You have to understand that this was 1985, and on movie sets you could walk into production and cocaine lines were right there on the table. It wasn't even hidden. It was unbelievable. So I'm there, and this guy comes up to me and asks if I'd like to be an extra, and I was like, an extra what? And he said, can you act like a convict? I thought it was a joke. I did 11 years in prison, so I said, I'll give it a shot. This is when Trejo's next big break happened. As he took off his shirt to change into the prison uniform being handed to him, the film's screenwriter, Edward Bunker, who also spent time in San Quentin at the same time as Trejo, just so happened to be walking by and recognized Trejo's large chest tattoo of a voluptuous woman wearing a sombrero. The tattoo is of one of the legendary fighting cowgirls of the Mexican Revolution. This was inked by fellow inmate Harry Ross over the course of a year or so due to lack of materials to complete it in one sitting and because the two kept getting transferred around away from each other. Remembering his skills as a boxer in the clink, Bunker approached Trejo and offered him a job training Eric Roberts, Julia Roberts' brother, to box for $320 per day, which is about $750 today. He was also going to appear on screen as Eric's opponent. When they said they would pay $320 a day, I said, how bad do you want this guy beat up? They said, no, and told me I had to be real careful because Roberts was highly strung and might really start swinging at me. I said, for $320, you can give him a baseball bat. After appearing in Runaway Train, Trejo found himself being typecast as a criminal, often being called to play a thug by filmmakers who tell their crew to just get that Mexican guy with the big tattoo, which didn't bother Trejo. I remember the first time anyone interviewed me. It was this young Chicano out of college, real into La Raza. Danny, don't you feel like you're being stereotyped? You're always playing the mean Chicano dude with tattoos. So I lifted up my shirt and said, what are you talking about? I am the mean Chicano dude with tattoos. Plus, in movies there's only room for one good guy, but there are always lots of bad guys. I have no problems at all. Trejo found this role easy, calling on his days as a criminal to make up for his lack of traditional acting training. When you're in a prison yard and someone is going to come down, you really want to be locked up in your cell, but instead you have to stand and pretend you're not afraid. That's acting. For a more direct example, early in his career, he was filming a scene in which he had to rob a store and managed to nail it on the first take. The director asked me to kick down a door holding a sawn-off shotgun and hold up 15 people. After the scene, people clapped and said, "My God, where did you study?" I said, "Supermarkets and Bank of America." This wasn't hyperbole. Among the many crimes he committed in his youth, he robbed several stores and banks. His general modus operandi in the latter case was to intentionally cause the bank alarm to be tripped and then observe how long it took the police to respond. He stated that back then it was usually around 4 minutes. He and his cohorts would later steal a car and go in to rob the bank for real, usually trying to keep everyone as calm as possible to expedite the robbery and avoid anyone getting trigger happy. This worked. Despite committing armed robbery on numerous occasions, he states, "I never got arrested for armed robbery. Mine was all drugs." After years of appearing as an extra, during which time Trejo appeared in so many movies he sometimes turns on the TV and becomes shocked when he sees himself in a film he doesn't remember being a part of, Trejo has become a Hollywood staple and one of its most reliable and prolific character actors. Beyond the more recognizable titles he's appeared in, like Con Air, Heat, Desperado, Machete, and Spy Kids, he still tries to do 4 or 5 student films per year. You have to. You have to remember the joy and passion of a new filmmaker who has his first $100,000 and the passion that he or she brings to it. It's so unbelievable to watch and nurture them. With his name attached to a given student film, it also tends to help the budding filmmaker get the needed money to make the movie in the first place. Outside of acting, Trejo also continues to counsel youths about drinking and drugs, using his star power combined with his life experiences to reach them in a way that most adults can't. My passion is talking with kids. The gift of being able to go into a juvenile hall and talk to kids, because it's almost impossible because kids have no attention span whatsoever. But because of my role in Machete, the minute I walk onto any campus, I have their undivided attention. This movie has been such a gift because I can walk into any prison, San Quentin, whichever, and these kids will listen. They won't listen to psychologists, parents, teachers, no one. But for me, they go out of their way to listen because they believe and trust I understand their lives. And of course I do, and did even before I filmed Machete. My message to them is, we don't drink, we don't use drugs, we help other people, and our lives will get better. Most importantly, make the decision to believe in yourself. As far as his acting career, acting for me is like being a contractor or a plumber or a house painter. A lot of people in the business look at acting as something special. To me, it's just a job. Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching the Today I Found Our YouTube channel, and in the video today we're looking at the soldier who voluntarily became a prisoner in Auschwitz. So just before we get started with this one, I will say that there are a lot of foreign names in this one. If I do make any mispronunciations, I apologize in advance. So the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, and this was despite the best efforts of Captain Witold Pilecki and his fellow Polish soldiers. On November the 9th of that same year, Witold and Major Wlodarkiewicz founded the Tajna Armia Polska, TAP, your Polish Secret Army, an underground organization that eventually became consolidated with other resistance forces into the Home Army. Not long after the formation of organized widespread Polish resistance, its members began hearing reports of the conditions within the newly constructed Auschwitz concentration camp put into operation in the spring of 1940. Those first reports originated with prisoners released from the camp and from civilians such as railroad employees and local residents. In order to cut through the very troubling rumors and figure out exactly what was going on there, Pilecki came up with a bold plan: become a prisoner at Auschwitz. With a little convincing, his superiors agreed to allow him to go. In order to protect his family after he was captured, he took on the alias of Tomasz Serafiński, much to the chagrin of the real Tomasz Serafiński, who was thought to be dead at the time, hence why his papers and identity were chosen, but he was actually not dead. Later, real Tomasz had some problems because of Pilecki using his papers and name. More on this in a bit. According to Eleonora Ostrowska, owner of an apartment Pilecki was at when he was taken, when a Nazi roundup began, a Lepanka, where a city block would suddenly be closed off and most of the civilians inside would be rounded up and sent to slave labor camps, and sometimes even just mass executed on the spot, a member of the resistance came to help Pilecki hide. Instead, Ostrowska said, "Witold rejected those opportunities and didn't even try to hide in my flat." She reported that soon a German soldier knocked at the door and Pilecki whispered to her, "Report that I have fulfilled the order," and then opened the door and was taken by the soldier along with about 2,000 other Poles in Warsaw on September the 19th, 1940. Now, it is important to note here that he didn't really know if he'd be sent to Auschwitz at this point. As Dr. Daniel Palawoda noted of Pilecki's capture, since the AB Acticon and roundups were still going on, the Nazis could have tortured and executed him in occupied Warsaw's Pawiak, Mokoto, or any other Gestapo-run prison. They could also have taken him to Palmyra to murder him in the forest. At the very least, they could have sent him to a forced labor colony somewhere in Germany. While he was willingly surrendered with the hope of being sent to Auschwitz, Pilecki lamented the behavior of his fellow countrymen during the roundup. What really annoyed me the most was the passivity of this group of Poles. All those picked up were already showing signs of crowd psychology, the result being that our whole crowd behaved like a herd of passive sheep. A simple thought kept nagging me: stir up everyone and get this mass of people moving. As he had hoped, probably the only person to ever hope such a thing, he was sent to Auschwitz. He later described his experience upon arrival. We gave everything away into bags, to which respective numbers were tied. Here, our hair of head and body were cut off, and we were slightly sprinkled by cold water. I got a blow to my jaw with a heavy rod. I spat out my 2 teeth. Bleeding began. From that moment, we became mere numbers. I wore that number, 4859. We were struck over the head not by SS rifle butts, but by something far greater. Our concepts of law and order and of what was normal, all those ideas to which we had become accustomed on this earth, were given a brutal kicking. Pilecki also noted that one of the first indications that he observed that Auschwitz was not just a normal prison camp was the lack of food given to prisoners. In his estimate, the rations given to prisoners were calculated in such a way that people could live for 6 weeks. He also noted that a guard at the camp told him, "Whoever will live longer, it means he steals." Assessing the conditions inside Auschwitz was only part of Pilecki's mission. He also took on responsibility for organizing a resistance force within the camp. This was called the Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, or ZOW. I'm screwing the pronunciation up on that for sure. The goals of ZOW included improving inmate morale. They also distributed any extra food and clothing, set up an intelligence network within the camp, and trained prisoners to eventually rise up against their guards and liberate Auschwitz. Ensuring the secrecy of the ZOW led Pilecki to create cells within the organization. He trusted the leaders of each cell to withstand interrogation by the guards, but even so, each leader only knew the names of the handful of people under his command. This limited the risk to the entire organization should an informant tip off a guard or if a member was caught. Pilecki's first reports to the Polish government and Allied forces left the camp with released prisoners, but when releases became less common, passing reports onto the outside world largely depended on the success of prisoner escapes, such as one that occurred on June 20th, 1942, where 4 Poles managed to dress up as members of the SS, weapons and all, and steal an SS car which they boldly drove to the main gate of the camp. A cobbled-together radio built over the course of 7 months as parts could be acquired was also used for a while in 1942 to transmit reports until one of our fellows' big mouth resulted in the Nazis learning of the radio, forcing the group to dismantle it before they were caught red-handed and executed. Pilecki's reports were the first to mention the use of Zyklon B gas, a poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas, as well as gas chambers used at the camp. He saw the first use of Zyklon B gas in early September 1941 when the Nazis used it to kill 850 Soviet POWs and Poles in Block 11 of Auschwitz I. He also learned of the gas chambers at Auschwitz II, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, from other resistance members after construction of the camp began in October 1941. ZOW also managed to keep a pretty good running log of roughly the number of inmates being brought into the camp and the estimated number of deaths, noting at one point over 1,000 a day from the new transports were gassed. The corpses were burnt in the new crematoria. All of the reports were sent to the Polish government in exile in London, and they in turn forwarded the information to other Allied forces. However, on the whole, the Allies thought the reports of mass killing, starvation, brutal and systemic torture, gas chambers, medical experimentation were wildly exaggerated. It should be noted here that during Pilecki's nearly 3 years there, several 100,000 people were killed at Auschwitz, and beyond the death and horrific tortures, countless others were experimented on in a variety of ways by individuals such as the Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele. All total, it is estimated that somewhere between 1 to 1.5 million people were killed at the camp. Significant doubt surrounding the accuracy of his reports meant that Pilecki's plan to bring about an uprising inside Auschwitz never came to fruition. Pilecki had managed to convince his network of resistance fighters inside the camp that they could successfully take control for a short while and escape if the Allies and Polish undergrounds provided support. He had envisioned airdrops of weapons and possibly even Allied soldiers invading the camp. However, the Allies never had any intention of such an operation, and the local Polish resistance in Warsaw refused to attack due to the large number of German troops stationed nearby. The Nazi guards began systematically eliminating members of the ZOW resistance in 1943, and so, with his reports being ignored, Pilecki decided he needed to plead his case in person for intervention in Auschwitz. After handing over leadership of ZOW to his top deputies, he and 2 others were assigned to the night shift at a bakery which was located outside of the camp's perimeter fence. At an opportune moment, on the night of the 26th, they managed to overpower a guard and cut the phone lines. The 3 men then made a run for it out of the back of the bakery. As they ran, Pilecki stated, "Shots were fired behind us. How fast we were running, it is hard to describe. We were tearing the air into rags by quick movements of our hands." It should be noted here that anyone caught helping an Auschwitz escapee would be killed along with the escaped prisoner, something the local populace knew well. Further, the 40 square kilometers around Auschwitz were extremely heavily patrolled, and the escapees' shaved heads, tattered clothes, and gaunt appearance would give them away in a second to anyone who saw them. Despite this, all three not only survived the initial escape, but managed to get to safety without being recaptured. Unfortunately, Pilecki's plan to garner support for liberating Auschwitz never materialized. After arriving at the headquarters of the Home Army on August 25, 1943, and desperately pleading his case for the Home Army to put all efforts into liberating Auschwitz, he left feeling bitter and disappointed when the idea was discarded as being too risky. In his final report on Auschwitz, he mentioned in his report his superior's cowardliness. After this, Pilecki continued to fight for the Home Army, as well as trying to aid ZOW in any way he could from the outside. He also played a part in the Warsaw Uprising that began in August of 1944, during which he was captured by German troops in October of that year and spent the rest of World War II as a POW. Pilecki wrote his final version of the report on Auschwitz, later published in a book titled The Auschwitz Volunteer Beyond Bravery, after the war, while spending time in Italy under the Second Polish Corps, before being ordered back to Poland by General Władysław Anders to gather intelligence on communist activities in Poland. You see, the invading Germans had already been replaced by another occupying power, the Soviet-backed Polish Committee of National Liberation. This was a puppet provincial government set up on July 22, 1944, in opposition to the Polish government in exile, the latter of which was supported by the majority of Polish people and the West. During his 2 years at this post, he managed to, among other things, gather documented proof that the voting results of the People's Referendum of 1946 were heavily falsified by the Communists. Unfortunately, there was little the Polish government in exile could do. Even when his cover was blown in July of 1946, Pilecki soldiered on and refused to leave the country, continuing his work collecting documented evidence of the many atrocities against the Polish people being committed by the Soviets and their puppet government in Poland. For this, he was ultimately arrested on May 7, 1947 by the Ministry of Public Security. He was extensively tortured for many months after, including having his fingernails ripped off and his ribs and nose broken. He later told his wife of his life in this particular prison, Auschwitz compared with them was just a trifle. Finally, he was given a show trial. When fellow survivors of Auschwitz pled with the then Prime Minister of Poland, a survivor of Auschwitz and a member of the resistance in the prison himself, for the release of Pilecki, instead he went the other way and wrote to the judge, telling him to throw out record of Pilecki's time as a prisoner at Auschwitz. This was a key piece of evidence in Pilecki's favor, given one of the things he was being accused of was being a German collaborator during the war. And so it was, as part of a government crackdown on former members of the Home Army resistance, Pilecki was convicted of being a German collaborator and a spy for the West. This was among many other charges, which ultimately got him the death sentence via gunshot to the head. This sentence was ultimately carried out on May 25, 1948 by Sergeant Piotr Smetensky, the butcher of Mokotów prison. From then on, mention of Pilecki's name and his numerous historic acts were censored in Poland, something that wasn't changed until 1989 when the communist Polish government was finally overthrown. Witold Pilecki's last known words were reportedly, "Long live free Poland." Now, you might think at this point that it's strange that Pilecki frequently and quite willingly threw himself into incredibly dangerous situations, despite the fact that he had a wife and kids back home. Polish actor Marek Probos, who studied Pilecki extensively before portraying him in The Death of Captain Pilecki, stated of this, "Human beings were the most precious thing for Pilecki, and especially those who were oppressed. He would do anything to liberate them, to help them." Mirroring this, Pilecki's son later said his father would write that we should live worthwhile lives, to respect others and nature. He wrote to my sister to watch out for every little ladybug, to not step on it, but place it instead on a leaf because everything has been created for a reason. Love nature. He instructed us like this in his letters. It wasn't just his children he taught to respect life at all levels. 2 years after Pilecki was executed, and at a time when his family was struggling because of it, a man approached Pilecki's teenage son and stated, "I was in prison as a guard with your father. I want to help you because your father was a saint. Under his influence, I changed my life. I do not harm anyone anymore." And now for some bonus facts. As we mentioned, the real Tomasz Serafiński was not dead, as Pilecki had thought when he took his papers and assumed his identity. After his escape from Auschwitz, the real Tomasz was arrested on December 25, 1943 for having escaped from Auschwitz. He was then investigated for a few weeks, including a pretty brutal amount of strong-arming, but was finally released on January 14, 1944, when it was determined that he was not, in fact, the same individual who had escaped from Auschwitz. Afterwards, Pilecki and Tomasz actually became friends, and although Pilecki was killed, according to Jacek Pawlowicz, that friendship is alive today because Andrzej Pilecki visits their family and is very welcome there. In the early 2000s, certain surviving officials who were involved in Pilecki's trial, including the prosecutor Czesław Lipinski, were put on charges for being accomplices to the murder of Witold Pilecki. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, if you're looking for something else to watch, some more of our videos are on the screen over to the right, so just click on one of those to go and explore some content we made in the past. I hope you enjoy them, and thank you for watching.